Annual New York Metro Joint Cybersecurity Conference. It's a coalition of information security professionals from um, various different organizations. We started this in 2014. The reason being that we have a lot of members who are active in multiple organizations, as well as we have members who are unaware of some of their other organizations. So what started out as a simple joint meeting between two different parties ended up becoming a coalition of 14 different chapters at its height. This year we have, I believe, 7 different chapters involved from ISACA, ISSA, Internet Society, HTCIA, ACFE, Cloud Security Alliance, Infragard, and the Brooklyn Law Institute. We have a great lineup today. I would like to welcome our speakers. First, I'd like to thank the Internet Society for graciously providing the video setup and the live stream. And I'd like to actually introduce our very first speaker, Jeffrey Wagar from the New Orleans chapter of ISACA. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about protecting your systems there. And there's good economic reasons to do this. As you can see, IBM published in 2016 that it's about $76 per record, or if you had 1,000 records, $76,000 to clean up if you had a break-in. It would have been much better if you had regular IT security audits by a third party. That would have been cheaper. But what I'm going to talk to today is about actually preventing break-ins or responding to them extraordinarily quickly. And that's done simply by upgrading your server to the latest operating system, Windows Server 2016. That only costs $800, much cheaper than some of the other alternatives. Just a quick background of me. I'm currently located in New York City, but I served for a number of years as the president of the ISACA chapter in New Orleans. That's the Information Security Auditors Association. I spoke at their annual conference in 2016, which I actually hosted in New Orleans. And last year, I spoke at the Association of Record Managers annual conference, which was in Orlando, Florida. My background is as a security architect, and I also cover data analytics. Now, of course, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And there's 6 different major areas of computers. People usually have 1 or 2 certifications in an area, such as programming or something. I've been around a number of years. I've passed 43 certification exams across those 6 areas, which are security and servers. I'm a qualified administrator, networking, cloud computing. I've passed those exams, so I know how to protect clouds there. Data science, of course, is very useful for pouring through all that log traffic of what's going on to spot break-ins. And programming, writing programs to detect and remediate damage. So the information I'm going to show you now, I have culled from those 6 areas, and this is what I think would be most useful for you to know. Now, normally, when viruses come out within a week, Microsoft or Norton has discovered them and downloads to your antivirus software protection against it, and that's the end of that virus. They have to come up with a new one. But ransomware has been going on for several years. Why does it keep on succeeding when we're so quick to put an end to viruses? Well, people have taken steps to try and protect against ransomware. They say we have antivirus software installed. All our computers are patched and are up to date. And we also have strong login credentials and passwords. And these 3 steps are excellent things to do. Yet ransomware still somehow gets through. Why is that? Well, with our current network defenses, to detect viruses, our antivirus software needs to have a known signature, sort of a wanted poster. This is what the file looks like. When it scans your computer, if it spots that file, bang, it kills it there. But it needs to have a wanted poster. And to protect people's credentials, you have to depend on your users not opening unknown attachments or visiting infected websites, or logging into unsecure wireless networks at airport or cafes where when they're typing in their username and password to log into their office, someone is listening in over that unsecured wireless and is capturing their credentials. And if you have vendor equipment in your office, as hospitals and other places do there, you do depend on the vendors keeping their equipment patched and updated and protecting their credentials. You don't really usually have access to those vendors' equipment. Now, what's different between ransomware and viruses? Well, the biggest thing is economics. A virus, they originally came out, their targets were to steal credit card information, and they'd earn about $25 on the black market for every credit card they could sell. So they would flood the internet with millions of virus copies to try and capture as many credit cards off of people's home computers as they could. But because there were so many copies of that virus out there, very quickly a copy of the virus is soon captured by Microsoft, McAfee, and Norton. They create that wanted poster, and poof, your antivirus software is updated daily with those wanted posters, and that virus, gets stopped if it tries to get on your computer. But ransomware economics is quite different. They can earn many thousands of dollars from just a single attack. So there's no need to flood the internet with many copies. Just go after that one bank or so that you have targeted. Thus, no copy of the virus is captured. Well, without that, the antivirus software at your target company there is not going to have a wanted poster to recognize that ransomware file when it gets on their system. And of course, if no copy of the virus is captured, Microsoft and Apple that write the operating systems for these workstations and devices, they remain unaware of the vulnerability the ransomware attack is exploiting, and so no patch is issued to block the attack. So that's why ransomwares often go on for many months rather than are shut down within a week like the viruses are. So how are credentials stolen? Well, as we've mentioned, if you open an email attachment, that could run a program that then looks into your computer and steals credentials. So you tell people, well, don't click on those attachments if you're not really sure who it's coming from, and don't click on web links to sites you're not sure where they really are. And if they don't do those two things, that greatly reduces the chance that their credentials will be stolen. But there is a new tactic that's very effective. Websites that have infected advertisements require the user to do nothing. The infected code in the advertisement, and you see the little car driving along, being advertised supposedly by Ford, your browser is set to run that video. And hidden in there is infected code, and your browser says run it. It runs it, and now your computer is infected. Well, of course, you can tell people, stay away from shady websites and so forth so you don't get infected. Unfortunately, as this article shows, major sites, including the New York Times and the BBC, have been hit by ransomware malvertising. And this is not the fault of fine companies like the New York Times and the BBC. They don't program those ads. They're streamed in by an outside vendor, and they're depending upon the vendor to stop anything hostile coming to the New York Times website. And unfortunately, vendors have been fooled there. And we know people on Wall Street or over in London, they do log on to the New York Times and the BBC during the day to get the news because that can affect the stock markets there. Now, very responsible companies like the New York Times and BBC, they regularly patrol their website looking for infections and quickly shut them down if they find them. But of course, it doesn't take long for many people to be infected. An hour could be many, many companies. So the old defense of we'll just rely on people not connecting to shady websites doesn't work against this malvertising. They target some very useful websites to infect. So that line of defense won't work either. So what can we do? Well, Microsoft certainly became aware of these weaknesses, so they came out with some internal controls with their latest server operating system, Windows Server 2016. And these internal controls do great things to help protect you. The first thing they do is they detect unusual behavior. When they do, they issue an alert to the IT staff. They often are able to prevent the malicious code from executing, and sometimes they're even able to automatically perform repairs and remediation immediately, even before the IT staff can spring into action. So the rest of this seminar is to go over these internal controls, show you what they do so that you're aware of them, and you can go to your office managers and IT staff and say, do you know these internal controls are out there? They would greatly help our security department if you would just simply implement them. You don't need to buy anything. They're already built into the Windows Server operating system. You just need to enable them and configure them. So here's the first step, detect unusual behavior. Well, what is the server? I mean, it's a machine. What does it know is unusual? Well, some of the behavior that it can detect is, has any user's computer requested the names and addresses, the IP addresses of all computers on the network? I mean, a person at their workstation, they don't need to know that. They usually only connect to, say, the email server and perhaps the accounting server to type in their daily timesheet at the end of the day there, and a file server to pull some files. They don't need to go all the way around the office asking each computer, what's your name, what's your address there. That's really unusual behavior, something a virus does. Well, has any user's computer been pulling large amounts of data recently? Again, a classic sign of virus activity, and Server 2016 can detect that. And lastly, has a user or a vendor silently added a network device, such as a webcam, scanner, Amazon Echo, that can be easily accessed from the internet, opening a way into our network there. A lot of those devices are very simple devices, do not have sophisticated security. And gee, if someone plugs them into our network, our security people want to know about that new opening into our network. Now, when unusual behavior occurs, what can the server do? Well, it can give an advanced starting basis for the IT staff. It can tell them right away, here's the computer that's infected. Not only that, it can say, here's the name of the program, here's the file where it's located, and here's the date and time when it started executing. That's like telling the police, the guys that robbed the bank, they're at 550 West 54th Street, apartment 15 on the 3rd floor. That's a tremendous head start for the IT staff. Normally, the IT staff has to start searching all the computers in the office. That can take them a long time before they actually get to find the infected computer and start shutting it down. If you can tell them which computers are infected, here's the name of the program and here's where the file is, they can start remediating very quickly. And it also saves a lot of expense. If you have an outside vendor, he doesn't have to scan all 100 computers in the office. Here's the 3 that were infected, and here's the other computers they infected to. So this really is an excellent starting basis it can give for your IT staff if an infection occurs. The next thing it can do is there's a lot of circumstances where it can prevent the code from executing. An internal control called code integrity does these things. First, it scans the computer and compiles a list of all executable programs on that computer. An IT administrator looks at that list and he checks off which ones are approved to run, such as Microsoft Word, Outlook, and so forth, and tells the operating system of the computer it's okay to run those approved programs. Now, if a virus does evade your defenses and gets on that computer and it tries to start itself up, the operating system looks at the whitelist, says that executable file is not on my approved list, and Windows won't start up that file no matter if you click on it, no matter what you do, it's not on the approved whitelist, it won't start up. So this is an excellent way. It doesn't need a wanted poster, doesn't need to know the name of the program. It just knows that that program is not on the whitelist. So it's very good against new viruses for which there isn't a wanted poster yet. In addition to going by the names of the programs, you could also go by the publisher. You could say, here's the publishers of software that are approved to run their code on my computer, such as Microsoft, Adobe, and Oracle. Well, gee, that newly arriving virus program, it's not on the publisher's website. It's not from Microsoft, Adobe, and Oracle, and the operating system will once again not allow it to execute. Now, here's one that really makes me sleep better at night. Just enough administration is called this internal control. An IT administrator can sit down at a server and create a whitelist of approved commands that can be issued remotely to a server. Some of the commands you wouldn't want to be issued remotely would be ones like copy, delete, or encrypt. Encrypt, of course, being used by ransomware. So if a hacker does get into one of your servers there and wants to execute encryption for his ransomware, the operating system is going to say, I'm sorry, but I won't execute that command. That command, I can detect it's coming through the network port of the server there, and I won't execute the encrypt command unless it's typed at the keyboard, comes in over the cable through the keyboard port. That's on my forbidden list. So that's very helpful there. If you don't have a wanted poster, they successfully evade your defenses, a hacker gets on, and he doesn't download any program there for your software. He's just going to be typing away at his keyboard, but it's a remote keyboard, and you've issued commands that he can't use there. So this just enough administration can allow simple remote commands that are not harmful to be executed remotely, but can stop someone from issuing the delete command to wipe out your files, the copy command to steal them, or the encrypt command to launch a ransomware attack. So this is very good against remote administrators. Now, denial of service attacks. These are very frustrating to security people because there's seemingly nothing on your system. You've successfully protected your system. This is all occurring from outside your system. It's as if 100 people started calling the phone number of the phone on your desk. Your customers can't get through because your phone's ringing all the time with these fake phone calls there. Well, web servers get overwhelmed, and this was a popular tactic in Russia. Someone would have a rival car dealership down the street, and they would arrange for a Russian hacker to launch a denial of service attack against the website of that other car dealership. And they couldn't get any sales over the internet because nobody could log on to their web server because it was under a denial of service attack. Well, an internal control of Windows Server 2016 called response rate limits can be set. If any outside computer issues more than 5 requests per second, and that's the number I've picked for the response rate limit, drop that connection and blacklist that computer's IP address. So if they immediately call back, you don't even pick up the phone. So even if they recruit hundreds of computers, within a couple of minutes, you're going to have blacklisted the internet addresses of all those hundreds of computers and completely ignore them, and regular traffic is able to resume. All quicker than your IT staff can do anything. And really, there isn't much your IT staff can do because there's nothing on their network for you to change there. So this is an excellent automatic springs to life defense against denial of service attacks. Now, here's where you haven't had a malicious attack. These are just things that can go wrong but have very serious consequences. A database server is taken offline because the operating system crashed, or physical equipment fails. Disk drives, network cards, these things do wear out and can go awry. Of course, you could have a hacker blocking access to that server there. Well, there's an internal control called network controller that routinely calls each server in your office once a minute and detects if it's unresponsive. If it is, it's automatically going to shift all the office traffic over to a secondary server. So any server that goes offline due to crashing or hackers, within a minute, it's going to shift the office traffic to a backup server so your people can continue working. Meanwhile, it issues an alert to the IT staff who go over and start to work on that damaged server. But the good thing is your customers and employees automatically have been shifted over to that backup server. Normally, the IT staff would have to go around to each office computer and reset it to point to that backup server. Not with this network controller. It's automatically going to do that for everyone there. So this is another very good automatic remediation that can spring to life within 1 minute of a server becoming unresponsive. Now, suppose your database server is encrypted by ransomware. Well, every write that was sent to that disk drive of that database server, such as someone's typing in their daily worksheet there, as those keystrokes were going to that primary database server, a copy of them was sent to a secondary server. So the network controller calls the primary server once a minute, detects it's now unresponsive, automatically shifts you to that secondary server that it's been streaming people's keystrokes to there. So now they're able to resume doing payroll or whatever they were doing on that database server, instead of being out of action until the original server is recovered. So once again, keeping your employees and customers up and running is an excellent thing for your business. What about vendor equipment though? If that vendor software goes down, you don't know how to install it. You need to get the vendor to get online to reinstall it on another server, and that could be hours, it could be days there. Well, they have a solution for that too. Windows Server 2016 has a feature called containers. When a vendor goes to install software, you create a container and say, okay, now install your software inside this container. That container not only captures their software, it also captures each keystroke they use to install it. So if that vendor's server becomes unavailable, you can take a backup copy of that container, drop it, literally drag and drop it on another Windows Server 2016, and it will immediately replicate that container. All the vendor's software in it, all the vendor's keystrokes that installed it, and it will be up and running within minutes without you having to wait for the vendor's IT staff to come and reinstall their vendor's software. Now, here's another one that's very useful. Many places use SQL. Well, this isn't built into Windows Server 2016. This is built into Microsoft SQL 2016, but it's such a valuable feature that I've included this internal control. One of the ways that they steal information is when it's unencrypted, because you certainly can have data encrypted, but when you go to use the data, you need to unencrypt it. And one of the major chains, Walmart or Target, they had information stolen from the cash registers because people's credit card information was unencrypted when it was in the memory of those computer cash registers. And that was very shrewd work by the hackers. Well, SQL 2016 is going to keep data encrypted even when it's in memory and when it's in transit, foiling eavesdroppers. The decryption keys are not stored on the SQL server itself. You pick a trusted office computer, such as the internal auditor's workstation or the office manager's workstation, and you put the decryption keys on that. So when someone goes to retrieve information from a database server, it's encrypted on the database server, it's sent over the network encrypted to their computer, it arrives on their computer encrypted. Their computer sends a signal to that trusted office computer elsewhere in their office, sends the encrypted information over to it, and receives the decrypted information back. Why is this very useful? Well, suppose that database server actually isn't on-premise. Suppose it's in a data center, a cloud data center run by one of the big vendors like Amazon or Microsoft. Well, gee, if the information is always encrypted at that data center, then the cloud vendor personnel and IT staff there cannot read it, because when they send a request to it, or if they look in the memory of that database server, it's still encrypted. The only time it's decrypted is when it's actually after it's arrived in your office. So now you can safely use cloud vendors and store databases on them, knowing that those databases will always be encrypted and will be encrypted in transit with the cloud vendor. They will never have access to the decrypted version, and they don't even have access to the decryption keys. They're stored in your local office. So it makes it much safer now to put the databases out on cloud vendors if you use this internal control called Always Encrypted that stores the encryption keys on your local office and keeps the traffic encrypted always when it's outside the office or in transit. Here's another one there. What about if you have an internal employee who is going to take information? Like suppose you have a salesman who's going to leave and go to a competitor. Well, gee, it'd be nice if he was able to bring up the records of all your customers, what things they buy, their names and addresses and so forth, and take those with him so he can start calling them and getting business. Well, SQL 2016 has a feature called row-level security, where you can set a filter for each user account and say, here's how I want you to filter the information so that they can only see some of the records, not all of the records in the database. For example, you can say for each of the nurses here at our hospital, we only want her to be able to see the medical records of patients whose nurse is herself. They have a problem sometimes in California at their hospitals where celebrities check in. And of course, it becomes great gossip if you can find out why is that celebrity here? Do they have some scandalous disease or what's going on with them? Well, gee, the nurses can't bring up that information because they're not the nurse for that patient. And as I said with salesmen, they can bring up the information for their sales account, but not for other people's accounts. And of course, auditors always worry that if something malicious happens by an internal employee, that they'll go back and erase data to cover their tracks. Well, gee, one of your criteria for what data they can see is they can only see data whose transaction date is today. So if you have data entry employees who are going and putting information in, they cannot go back and change records of anything that was entered the day before or earlier. So that helps protect an audit trail for auditors and also for IT administrators who want to trace down the source of malicious activity. Use this row-level security, this time filtering not on their name, but by date, so people can't go back and change records. So in summary, we've seen that if you outsource your security by granting network access to outside vendors, you run the risks of them using the decryption keys to seeing your data or their computers getting infected and therefore infecting you. Now, of course, there's a number of excellent outside security vendors who don't do this. They have very good internal controls themselves. But your IT budget must pay a recurring monthly fee to them, and you may not have enough money in your budget. So what can you do? Well, we've seen from this seminar, you can educate yourself and defend yourself. Learn the latest operating system for servers because they have these behavior-based internal controls now that come with them. These controls detect unusual behavior. They issue an alert to the IT staff. They will prevent malicious code from executing in many circumstances, and they can even automatically perform repairs and remediation within minutes, faster than your IT staff can spring into action there. So that's a summary of my workshop, and if you have any questions, I'm certainly, John can forward them to me. Let me see if I can stop sharing and turn this back over to John Chucko.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I'm just waiting to see if you have any questions. Just post it in the live stream chat.
And you can tell them that you have a takeaway that lists these different internal controls in case they weren't able to write them down fast enough. They can get that takeaway from you that lists them so they can take them to their IT staff and office administrator.
That's correct. And actually for all the speakers that have allowed their presentations to be shared either through PDF or other means, I will be posting them on our website for download afterwards. I see no questions. So let's move on. Our next speaker is Alan Brill from Kroll. Let's see if I can get Alan's slides up here. Just a second.
And John, I think you'll be manipulating the slides for me. So let's bring up the first slide.
Okay. Just can you see that yet?
Hasn't hit the live stream yet.
Just wait a minute. Okay, can you see it yet?
Yep, it's up and running. So let me get started.
Okay. Just for kicks, I'm going to make Alan do a beeping noise so I can advance the slide. Alan, please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, and it's good to be with everybody today. My name is Alan Brill. I'm a Senior Managing Director at Kroll, which is a unit of Duff & Phelps, a well-known consulting firm, as is Kroll. In addition to my work as a Senior Managing Director in Kroll's Cyber Risk Group, I also teach some courses on cyber terrorism for the NATO Alliance. And I'm also an adjunct professor at the Texas A&M School of Law, where I teach in our program, which for those who are attorneys grants an LLM in risk management, and for others gives a degree called a Master of Jurisprudence in Risk Management. So as I guess I'm an instructor also, as I said, for Texas A&M, I should start by saying howdy, everyone, and thanks for being with us today. I'd also like to just read a very brief disclaimer for the record, and you'll see them on the slides. Now, these slides in this presentation have been prepared for general information purposes only. They do not and should not be construed to constitute legal or other professional advice. So with that, I'm going to be talking about people. And the thing to remember is that in all the years that I've been looking at cybercrime, I've never yet run into a cybercrime that was committed by a computer. They may run on computers, they may be facilitated by computers, but generally there's a person behind it that we look to. Now, will this continue? How will artificial intelligence change that? You know, and will we get to a point where we have to think about how to make an artificial intelligence, self-learning, deep learning computer a defendant in a criminal case? And the answer is, I don't know. But what I do know, and let's advance the slide, is that right now there is a danger. And the danger is that we focus too much on the technology, the cyber side, and not enough on the fact that if you think about the different disciplines in the organizations that are part of the Joint Cybersecurity Group, we worry about things like people. We worry about things like internal controls. We worry about things like policies and procedures. And my talk today is to really focus on why those things are and will remain important and, in fact, central to cybersecurity. I want to talk about 5 things. First, the nature of the problem. Why are we continuing to see issues? Why are those issues evolving so quickly? And I'd like to then turn to the fact that, as you all probably know, in recent weeks, regulators, particularly the Securities and Exchange Commission, has been talking about cybersecurity and threat responsive controls, as one way to put it. I then like to talk about standards, policies, procedures, and how those mirror, or in many cases may not mirror, reality. And then I'd like to go into how this has become a global issue, and in fact, sometimes a global issue for companies that didn't know that they were global. And then I think it becomes important to close by answering a question, and a simple question to pose at least, and it is, what's a company to do? So let's proceed to the next slide. When we think about the nature of the problem, the one thing that is certain in an uncertain world is that when it comes to cybersecurity, we're shooting at a moving target. And that target is one that cannot be looked at solely from a cyber perspective, but has to be looked at from the perspectives of technology, law, regulation, best practice, and probably a dozen others that any of you could name. John, let's move to slide number 4, please. And I'd like to consider, just as a starting point, some events that have happened in the past few weeks. Some of you will undoubtedly know about these in some detail. Some of you may know about them, but may not have gone into the depth of reading the various legal documents, complaints, orders, investigative reports. Now, let's just think about a few of them. The SEC announced a $1 million settlement with Voya for what were felt by the commission to be issues relating to their cybersecurity. Facebook had a compromise that, depending upon which news release you looked at, might have affected 50 million people, or maybe 30 million people, or maybe some other number of people. But regardless of which number you look at, it was an awful lot of people, wasn't it? And probably affected many of us on the call. The SEC filed a lawsuit against Elon Musk and against the Tesla company based on several Twitter tweets that Mr. Musk sent about a private buyout of the company. There is a proposed settlement. I don't think it's been finally adjudicated by the supervisory judge, but the settlement that was put before the judge for evaluation called for a financial penalty of $20 million from Mr. Musk and $20 million from Tesla, on the basis they should have been better supervising the use of social networks to make important announcements. A couple of days ago, the SEC issued an investigative report on business email compromises and warned that it was looking at accounting and other controls to be continuously updated as the threat environment changes. This investigation looked at 9 companies that had been victims of business email compromises. And while the commission staff found, as a result of these investigations, that there were problems, the commission decided not to proceed with enforcement actions. But they felt that this was an important enough subject to issue a public investigative report that didn't name the names of the victims, but certainly should be delivering the message that this is something you need to worry about. According to Gemalto, in their breach level index published for the first 6 months of 2018, they followed 945 breaches that resulted in the compromise of $4.5 billion that's billion with a B, records, which included financial, healthcare, PII, and others. If you do the math, that's the equivalent of an average of about 25 million records a day, or 291 people's records being compromised on average every second, 24/7, over a period of 6 months. If you look at one of the new emerging areas of cryptocurrency, CipherTrace reports that in that same period, $760 million of value of virtual currencies were lost due to hacker activity, which was a little bit more than 3 times the amount that was lost in all of 2017. Now, they are not suggesting in their report that this was due to the hackers being able to somehow break the security of the blockchain or of other distributed ledger technologies. But for the most part, these were pretty much good old-fashioned attacks that worked, but were an enabler for the bad guys to take control of virtual currency wallets that were stored by the organizations they victimized. And whether we're talking the amounts of these settlements, whether we're talking the number of records, whether we're talking the $760 million lost in hacks of virtual currency sites, we're talking big numbers. And before I go on, let me say that everything we're talking about, while in some cases I'm using the specific examples cited by the Securities and Exchange Commission, by no means am I suggesting that what I'm talking about should be limited in interest to those whose organizations may be overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They are not the only regulator talking this way. Certainly, the other financial regulators are putting time and resources into this. Certainly, others like the Federal Trade Commission have shown an interest. And as we'll see, there are a couple of other reasons why, even for organizations that are not directly supervised by a federal regulatory agency, I think there's good reason to take these lessons very personally. Let's go to slide number 5, please. So the one thing that is certain from looking at all of the reports that I've talked about and the reports that I would bet that most of you on the call have looked at, the velocity of change in cybersecurity and internal control, if anything, is rising. But it also turns out, and again, this is something that you'll know, that many of the incidents and problems that we read about, that we see, were preventable. And, there are questions we can all ask. Why was the cyber security that was found problematic in the Voya case the way that it was? Why were the tweets that were the subject of the Elon Musk Tesla case brought in federal court by the SEC able to go out as they were? Why are business email compromises actually working so well and so frequently that the SEC would go to the time, expense, and trouble of putting out a report on the 15th, which is certainly worth reading if you haven't read it, that goes into a lot of details about these compromises? Why are businesses in the virtual currency world being hit with successful attacks that aren't attacking the underlying distributed ledger technology, but seem to be working so well, with millions of dollars lost, often forever? Why are so many attacks using well-known, well-documented, well-understood methodologies so successful, and why is that the case on a continuing basis? I think the answer to that, or at least to some of those questions, are that the bad guys who we talk about, and when I use the term bad guys, some of those bad guys can be female as well as male. I don't think the computer cares who is stealing from it, but I'll just use, in some cases, the term the bad guys. Why are they so successful? Because they understand not only technology, but they understand that people underlie the entire technology system. And I think it is true to say that if an organization doesn't accept the concept that building effective controls, actually implementing those controls, having a good compliance program in place to let you know if your controls are in place, if they're working, if there are new risks, and not having a continuous improvement program that can make sure that your responses are in line with the changing risk. If you don't really accept that as an organization, that is definitely not a good thing. And John, let's go to slide 6, please. I'd like to talk about the fact that regulators have been focusing on cybersecurity and the need to have internal controls, both cyber-related, accounting-related, process-related, as something that you need to look at. And with that, I'd like to go to slide number 7. So earlier this year, if we go back to probably about February of March of 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission put out a number of documents which essentially said that the SEC, along with other regulatory agencies, understand the importance of cybersecurity and that there is an absolute expectation on the part of the regulators that companies would heed that guidance and pay attention to having effective cybersecurity, commercially reasonable cybersecurity, cybersecurity that is compliant with the guidelines of regulators, along with any other guidelines that organizations have recognized that they should be following, whether those are something as simple as the CIS Top 20 or the standards that we find from ISO or from NIST or from ISACA or anybody else, that those be really important and that those be something that companies recognize are guidance that has to be heeded. As I said before, the SEC is not the only ones looking at it. As many of you know, the role of the Federal Trade Commission in cybersecurity was affirmed by the Third District Court of Appeals in the Federal Trade Commission v. Wyndham case. And regulators like the FDIC, Control of the Currency, are all giving versions of the same message. State-level regulators are not ignoring the issue. We can look at some of the regulatory guidance in the laws recently passed in California as an example. We can look at the regulations promulgated by the New York Department of Financial Services. But we should also recognize that an honest look at the situation shows us that both state regulators and state attorney general are mindful of this issue and have expectations that companies will heed good practices with relationship to cybersecurity and operational controls. Let's go to slide 8, please. There is underlying all of this when I talk to friends in the regulatory agencies. A recognition that cybersecurity, which was something that they used to really think of pretty much as a separate area of interest and consideration, isn't anymore. It is now so intertwined in every phase of a company's operations that you can't realistically think of cybersecurity as a completely separate issue. It's one of the basics, like effective accounting controls, but it is deeply intertwined and has become a touchstone for every phase of security and control within the modern organization. Now, when I talk to colleagues in the regulatory agencies, they remind me and have asked me to remind you that they are not just talking the talk. They have invested significant resources and have brought aboard and have trained people who are now completely qualified to look at cybersecurity from a conceptual level and at the deepest operational and technical levels. They know how to conduct cyber-related investigations and to draw conclusions from those investigations. They are absolutely not hesitating to bring enforcement actions and to pursue those actions vigorously. The regulators understand that aside from the fact that you bring these actions to specifically remediate and to an extent punish behavior by an individual or an individual within an organization, that you also bring these to send a message to an industry or to those across many industries. They expect that institutions recognize that the guidance that they have been talking about over the past few years do not represent their suggestion to you as a friend, but rather you have to take those as a statement of actual expectations, and that ignoring the guidance for those organizations that are regulated is something that you do at your own risk. And ignoring it is not going to make the regulators go away. It is not going to give you a free pass with an assumption that they're going to ignore you. Let's go to slide number 9. There's something else that they are reminding us of. And if any of you have read the order in the Voya case, you will find this on the last page of the order, not in the last paragraph before the signatures, but the one just above that. What the regulators are also saying is that the same conduct that a regulator might use to bring a regulatory action and to impose regulatory penalties against an organization can also be the subject of other litigation. For example, a shareholder suit could be launched against the company's officers and directors based on the identical problems and findings that were in a government agency's report or complaint. So that whether you're regulated or not, a class action could be filed on behalf of shareholders or any other relevant constituency, saying that the management and the board did not exercise the control that they were required to exercise that could have prevented an issue that actually came about to come about, or to properly protect the value of the company, which can suffer both as a result of direct losses or reputational damage if an incident does occur. They're also saying that the controls, whether we think of them as cyber controls or accounting controls, have to be based not just on what somebody feels like doing or just sort of thinks is right, but on the basis of an updated and documented risk assessment. This is not a matter of guesswork. It is not just a matter of, yeah, I've done this before, but what the regulators, and I think based upon what the regulators are doing, what the courts are likely to be looking at in the future, is that you have a security plan, both cyber and accounting, that is based on a fair evaluation of the risks that you are facing as those risks evolve, whether that risk involves a business email compromise, whether that risk involves the kinds of issues that can be remediated by going to a newer version of an operating system, whether it's something that could have been averted through better training, a better program of internal audits and compliance. And they're saying is you gotta have a good risk assessment that should be in writing to show that your plan was based on a realistic view of what the dangers were. Now, I think that as I look across the regulatory agencies that I and my colleagues both at Kroll and at Duff & Phelps talk to regularly when we look at the cases that come across the desks of our people in the work that we do, I think there's one more very important point that the regulators are collectively making, and that is that without the commitment of people at the top and of people at every level of an organization, technology alone cannot save a company from cyber risks. And let's go to the next slide, which is really a title slide. So let's just go, John, to slide 11. As John had mentioned, by the way, this slide deck in the form of a PDF will be available to you. So recognize that you can have a copy of this. I tried to put a bunch of words on them simply so that they would be useful to those of you listening or those of you who listen to this later, and that you can adapt them for your own use. So let's talk about standards and policies and procedures, and let's compare and contrast them against reality. So good intentions with regard to standards, policies, and procedures are good, but they ain't documentation. Yes, we all understand that good security starts with a commitment from senior management and increasingly from the board. But that commitment must be accompanied by the intention, the willingness, and the ability to expend the necessary resources, whether those resources are people, money for technology, money for outsourced services, whatever it is, to achieve a commercially reasonable, regulatory compliant set of controls and security measures. That's what you will be measured against, either by a regulator or through the oft painful process of litigation. But those commitments should be documented And they should sit at the top of what you could think of as a pyramid of standards and policies and procedures and controls and compliance measures and a continuous improvement process by which you not only recognize issues that come about through the evolution of risk, but from the lessons that you learn from incidents that actually affect your organization. Documentation, of course, is not a one and done process. As the risks evolve, as you hear about cases of actual problems, these represent risks that were less severe or different in the past. And you have to have that commitment that I'm talking about to a continuous improvement program. And I think no matter what framework you look at, they all include that. So let's go to slide number 12. I had a case some time ago where a company had gone through multiple substantial data breaches. But when we were in there doing the investigation and got a hold of their standards and policies and procedures manual, it was a work of art. I can tell you on my academic side, if this was given to me by a student as a term project, the student would get an A+ in honors. They were beautiful. They were well crafted. They were well written. They were literate. I've never seen a better set of standards anywhere. Unfortunately, we discovered when we interviewed the CIO that when we wanted to discuss those standards, the CIO started laughing at us. And when we looked kind of curious as to why mentioning the standards would cause hysteria, he told us that they were actually written by a group of summer interns that he was, to use his words, forced to hire. And he told us this as far as he was concerned, and he was the CIO, so that was pretty important. These standards were, and again, I'm using his words, aspirational. Yes, of course he'd like to do them. Yes, he recognizes that it would be great if he could do them, but resources were scarce. He felt that the security worked in his company mostly because people just knew what to do and they knew what not to do. But when we looked at the discovery material that had been provided in the case, we found that that very manual that he called aspirational had been presented to the board of directors, and in the presentation to the board, nobody said aspirational. They said, yep, this is what we're doing, and the board believed them, and as a result, kind of felt good about how things were going. Aspirational standards are nice, but my friends, they do not cut the mustard or anything else. Let's go to slide 13. Now, good documentation is good, but the question that a regulator, a litigator, and your board should be asking is this: do the controls really work? And do they really work? Really? So not only were those standards, the aspirational ones, not actually being followed, but when we examined the organization to find out why there had been breach after breach after breach, we found that there were no processes in place to know exactly which controls were or were not actually implemented. So there wasn't a real compliance program. There was nothing to show what risks were or weren't considered because there was no documented risk assessment. Nobody, as a result of that, knew what gaps there were between the risks that should have been covered and what was or was not actually happening. There was, as I said, no compliance plan, no process by which problems raised in an actual incident would be focused on and really, really solved. And when we looked at the details of the second big breach that that organization had, it was in its essence identical to the first breach, but they never had a process to get to the root cause of the problem and make sure that it was fixed across their entire network, across all of their locations, across all of their offices. And as a result of that, the weakness that allowed the first breach to happen in one of their offices was able to be re-executed by the bad guys and start the chain of infection, of data loss, and of compromise again. Now, the regulators understood this, and the board and executives understood this, but the fact that there were no controls that would let somebody know that the things that you thought that were happening in your internal controls weren't really there. And that was at the heart of the problem. And let's go to slide 14, please. So we really do believe that in developing your system of controls in cybersecurity, that your compliance and your internal audit people should be a key part of the team from the outset to make sure there are ways to know whether your controls are or are not working. Over the years, I've seen far too many cases when compliance and internal audit wasn't brought in until fairly late in the program. And by that point, it became more and more difficult to really figure out how to audit, to have the resources to audit, to have the kinds of reports and warnings in place that a compliance or audit-oriented person would want to have in there. So they were playing catch-up. I'm also firmly of the belief that a system of controls, that cybersecurity, should be something that you engage your general counsel on. You want guidance to make sure that your documentation, your processes, and everything else are compliant with regulations. And very often, those represent a legal opinion. Further, as we've moved into what we all think of as cloud computing, we've seen many cases in which somebody within an organization finds a cloud provider, whether it's to do some sort of calculation or processing as a service or storage as a service, that can be engaged through a click-through contract and paid for on an employee's credit card, later reimbursed through an expense reimbursement system. That's not good. When you're clicking through that agreement, it is a legal agreement that may have things that would scare the hell out of your counsel. For example, what if there's no definition of where your data would be stored? What if your data was stored someplace that has strong cybersecurity laws and regulations that you never knew you were involved with? And that brings me to our final section of new information. And if we can go to slide 16. I have found many times that companies that thought they were purely domestic turned out, because of the evolution of technology, to be multinational. Now, you know that the trend to regulate security, cyber, privacy, is not limited to the United States. As I try to point out on this slide, an increasing number of countries and multinational organizations like the European Union have passed laws and regulations that specifically relate to cybersecurity, to privacy, to transborder data flows. So one question I ask you to ask is, do you know where your data is stored by your cloud provider? And I can tell you one place that it's not, because many times you'll ask the question, where is our data? And the answer is, it's in cyberspace. Well, that's fine, except for the fact that, as you know, cyberspace doesn't exist. Everything that happens in a computer or a storage device happens in a real piece of technology, in a real place, in a real country, subject to real laws. So, for example, if your cloud provider decides to venue your data storage in a country with laws relating to cyber protection, transborder data flow, privacy, your data may suddenly, whether you know it or like it or not, be subject to that country's laws. So have you checked with your business partner to determine where in the world your data is stored? Don't make an assumption that everything is okay. Find out. Find out what cloud-based contracts are in place, whether you know about them now or don't. Have counsel look at those, find out where the data is venued, find out where the processing is done, find out what is being held by the processor, and have counsel look to see whether how it's happening imposes regulatory, legal, or other requirements on you. So with that, let's go to slide 17. And as I really said, this is just another area where counsel, and this could be in-house counsel, it could be external specialized counsel, can really be invaluable. Have them look at contracts, have them look at agreements, have them look at things like data venue, data ownership, duty to notify if there is an incident, whether there is indemnification agreements in place that if your vendor screws up and you suffer a data breach of your client's information, your customer's information, whether you are insured by their insurer so that you don't get stuck with the bill. And with that, let's go to slide 18 and then slide 19. So, my friends, what's a company to do? I think we have to take it as a proven fact that regulators are absolutely focused on cybersecurity, use of social networks by companies. They are ready, they are willing, they are going to undertake investigations. They are going to file litigation. They are going to impose financial and potentially operational and potentially life and death type penalties to organizations that don't do the right thing. They are staffed. They are ready. They are serious about it. So I think you need to make a commitment from the very top, not just to give lip service to the concept of, yeah, we know this stuff is important, but to do the things listed on this slide, to carry out a risk assessment, to understand what you're protecting against, and to update it as necessary, to identify, determine how to deal with security gaps, to use a framework or at least a list of key security issues like the top 20 list to make sure that you're covering the basics along with making sure that you're compliant with regulations. Use risk mitigation, fix it, make the risks less likely to occur using both technical and non-technical means. Understand risk transfer, another way of saying insurance. What does it cover? What doesn't it cover? Do you have to think about the effects of things like not just cyber insurance, but the changes in regulatory expectations and the willingness of litigators to look at things like going after directors, going after company officers, which would affect what's called your D&O, director and officer coverage. And understand the risks that are being accepted as just part of what you need to do business. Make compliance and internal audit and counsel an integral part of your plan. Have a tested and ready to go incident response plan. There are new laws that say that once you become aware of an incident, you have to report it within 72 hours. That's not much time. And if you haven't pre-identified the vendors you're going to work with for forensics, if you're dealing with credit card data, you probably want to have an organization that is approved by the credit card industry as a preferred forensic investigator in place. You may want to have specialized counsel ready to go. You may want to have a crisis communication firm ready to go. In doing those, work with your insurer, because in many cases, they will have a panel of pre-identified experts who have agreed to provide those services at special rates for the insureds of the insured. So do that, test the process, have a tabletop exercise, have a backup to everybody that you think is a part of that process, because people go on vacation, people leave, people become unavailable. And have a process for continuous improvement. Recognize that what I am talking about and what we're talking about today in this webinar is fundamentally a commitment by people, so that while we talk about technology, technology alone is not the solution. As I said at the beginning, it's all about people. People on your board, people in your technology organization, people in your compliance group, people in your internal audit group, people in your operations group, people in your accounting function. Working together, we can make a difference. If we focus on the technology and don't focus on the people, we could be headed in a problematic direction. So, as it says on slide 20, thank you very much for listening. And let me now turn the chair back to my friend, John Checo.
Alan, thank you very much. And I'll solicit for questions, but I know there's a delay in the broadcast. So as we solicit for questions, I actually had two questions about your presentation. First of all, it's interesting because where Jeffrey said people have the capabilities to really help themselves do better. You pointed out the human nature where people actually have the capabilities of talking themselves out of doing something. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it really is, John, because if you look at the nature of the business email compromises, when you investigate them, and we get a number of these every week that come across our desks at Kroll, that the people that moved the money knew better. They really did. But they were able to be intimidated. They were able to be flattered. They were able to be coaxed to violate the rules that they knew were in place to the detriment of their organizations. So it is really about people. I think the number one thing that an organization can do to defend against like a business email compromise is to have your people really understand that if they do the right thing, follow the rules, you got their backs. That no matter the threats that are made on the emails, they're good as long as they follow the rules, tell somebody what's going on, and don't send out the money just because somebody asked you to do it. Don't change the bank that the money goes to just because somebody on an email or on a telephone call said to do it.
Cool. Actually, so one of the questions I had was about the 72-hour rule. I know in working through a bunch of incidents, there's a legal definition of incident, confirmed incident, and suspected incident. With the 72-hour rule, are they allowing for confirmed incident? And if that's the case, are they allowing? Is there a maximum time between suspected and confirmed?
Well, this is really based on the new rules that are part of GDPR and that are coming out of the European Union. And I guess the answer to that is it has to be, once you know something has happened. But beyond that, I haven't seen a lot of guidance. So what we're telling clients is it's smart to be ready. It's smart to have your plans in place for what you're going to do. It's vital to have the support pre-negotiated, since in a 72-hour scenario, you don't have a lot of time to play with terms and conditions of contracts, and that every organization is really going to do as well as it can, but recognize that working with specialized counsel who knows the details of the rules, ultimately you're going to have to comply with the rules as they're being interpreted.
And that's great, because that dovetails into my second question. You talked about plans being aspirational versus tactical.
Yes.
In my experience, how many of the regulations or standards have been aspirational versus tactical? And a good example is, the FFIEC is purely aspirational. GDPR is a regulation, but yet really open to some broad interpretation. So, wondering how we work around those things.
Well, I think the thing that's kind of interesting is I talked during my little presentation about the next to the last paragraph in the VOIA order. And in this, the SEC said, hey guys, don't just think about us. Think about the fact that the kinds of regulations that we're putting into place will be seen as an expectation on the part of shareholders, data subjects, and others who can without any action on our part, litigate against you and enter into a class action, enter into whistleblower complaints, enter into a whole range of things, so that you have to look beyond the regulators and what they can do and be prepared for the range of problems that can occur. And that's why I say, even if you're not regulated by any of the FFIEC family or the SEC or perhaps state regulators, you're still subject to litigation. You're still subject to all kinds of potential problems. But we found that those organizations that recognize that and operate on that basis tend to get through the incidents a lot better than those who get surprised when those actions are filed.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I see.
My pleasure. I hope it was useful for folks.
Yeah. No further questions in the chat. I'd like to introduce at this time Matthew Heath Van Horn from SUNY Delhi School of Business. Matthew.
Thank you, sir. My name is Matt Heath Van Horn. I spent 23 years in the Air Force in various cyber roles. I kind of lived and worked with many different types of hackers. So one of the things I did when I retired is that I thought carefully about hackers, and I wanted to do some studying for that for my PhD. And this is just a little bit of review of how that works. So if we use the definition, a traditional definition of a hacker, and I just retrieved this the other day because it really hasn't changed much. If we say a hacker is a person who illegally gains access and sometimes tampers with information computer systems, that's pretty much a definition of a hacker. Whether or not they work as a team, state-sponsored group, or other means such as anonymous, who they might not even know the other team members, the definition still is pretty portable. The problem with this definition is that it relies on three factors. It relies on the fact that hackers are people. That relies on whether or not their activities are legal or illegal. And then also relies on the computer system. what this does is that generates numerous problems for our security life. It's because, first of all, we look at the person and we don't understand their actions. We know that all technology is flawed, but we got to figure out which ways is it flawed. And laws are largely ineffective. So our solution has always been that we need more study of hackers. I love reading sociologists' take on hackers, and because really I could tell them that in one word, why hackers do what they do, and that's because of fun or money. We always say we need more technology to solve this problem. And really, it's not a technology problem. It is so much easier to hack a person than it is to hack the technology. But we always are more thirsty for more technology to solve our issues. And then, of course, there's always more laws. If we only had a law against going over state lines, if we only had a law against going over country lines, if we only had a law, and on and on and on and on. The more laws we have, then the more safer we've been. But as the last two speakers noted, is that hacking and data breaches and security, they're proliferating at an alarming rate. So none of these things have happened. We've been doing this research focus for 40 years, and it has not stemmed the source of hacking activities. So really what I found in the literature, when you go outside of these three areas, people, laws, or tech, that they look for a multidisciplinary approach. And so what I decided to do was I said, well, if we're going to do multidisciplinary, we need a multidisciplinary definition, or we just need a new definition altogether. So my idea was to create a new theory so we're not looking at these same three stovepipes. So I modified the definition. So I just simply said, a hacker is an individual with limited resources who can effectively disrupt the operations of large organizations and which have vast resources at their disposal. Which, again, it can be ported to teams and such like that, but really, the large organizations, they have the R&D, they got the auditors, they got the power, they've got millions of budget, and it all comes down to some individuals with a really souped up laptop, and they can break things down like nobody's business. And so that's why I modified the definition to that. After I modified the definition, I said, hey, I need to find similar occurrences where this has happened in the past. So one of the things, I'm not a historical buff, but I do like movies, and I do remember MASH that came out and says, and then there was Korea. There was an interesting event that happened in Korea. The United States, this was the first time that jet fighters were used in combat. The United States brought forth the F-86. It was technologically inferior, though we thought it was the cat's meow. It was heavy, it was slow, it was stable, which is great for a passenger jet, but terrible for a fighter jet. It did have one thing going for it, though. It had the radar gun sight. The effectiveness of this is debated even today. So whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing is up for debate. The other thing the United States had going into the Korean War was that the United States pilots had many rules they had many rules that they had to follow. They had law restrictions. They had a lot of things hindering their ability to conduct war. And then, on top of that, they had a president who wanted to fight the war, yet maintain a balanced budget policy. So they had a lot of restrictions on their technology, their people, and their law. On the other hand, you had North Korea, which had a MiG-15. Oh my goodness, that thing was beautiful. It's like a ballerina in the sky. It could outturn anything that the Air Force produced. It was heavily armed, so it was very effective. They had no restrictions because they were the aggressor. They could do anything they wanted. And there's no accurate spending information. So we can't make the assumption that they outspent or had unlimited resources. So that's a factor that we really can't consider. However, when you look at those two nations in the air war, the United States, besides being the underdog, had the superior kill ratio in air combat. They had a kill ratio of 10 to 1. Again, this number is disputed, and there are Korean War magazines out there that debate this every month. But that was what spurred me on to looking at this part of a particular area of research when it comes to hackers. Because really, what we're doing is people are trying to steal our information, and we're doing our best to prevent them from stealing that information. So it's a giant dogfight in cyberspace against two parties, the attackers and the defenders. So then when I looked further back, I found that this isn't the first time this has happened in warfare. It certainly isn't the first time it's happened. So you got the Battle of Marathon, where the kill ratio was 11 to 1. The Battle of Cannae, 19 to 1. Sterling Bridge, which they don't have a kill-loss ratio. However, that was the first time that the English longbow was defeated in battle by infantry. The longbow was the most dominant piece of technology and feared for 600 years until the rifle came out. There was no way the infantry should have won against heavy cavalry and the longbow. Then you got Shaka Zulu, where it was 1 to 1. However, again, spears versus rifles, that never should have happened. Never should have been such decisiveness. They should not have won. The Gulf War was 10 to 1. And then the Millennium Challenge, which most people in security know this battle, was 20 to 1. And the Marine General won with wooden boats versus a modern Navy. Yeah, there was other things involved, but he used old school World War II communications to effectively run his army. And within 24 hours, he sunk a third of the fleet. So that was quite the thing. And they all had the same thing in common. They were all hamstringed. They were all the underdogs because they had fewer resources, fewer technology than the adversaries they were going up against. So once I found a trend, I sought an explanation. And so there's this gentleman out there, his name is Colonel John Boyd. He was a fighter pilot. He saw a little bit of combat, but not much. But he was known as 42nd Boyd. And so the thing is his deal was he had a standing bet that if he was in the air against somebody else and he was in a defensive position, that in 40 seconds he could shoot them down, changing it from a defensive position to an offensive position. And he never lost the bet. He defined Air Force tactics, which slowly, Air Force dogfighting tactics, which slowly adopted by the rest of the world. So this is quite a smart guy. He was an engineer, and he helped design the F-15, the F-16, and the A-10. He was a military strategist. The reason the Gulf War resulted in so few casualties on the American side was basically because of his teachings. Everybody agreed that was his influence that won the first Gulf War. He'd never published a book. He never published an academic paper. What he did was he gave instructional seminars such as this one, except his were about 13 hours in length just for one topic. So using him as a research platform is difficult, but it can be done. One of the things that came out of this guy's mind was this thing called the OODA loop. And he'd kill me if I said the OODA loop because that's not how we referred to it. But this is how most people have come across this decision making before. The observe, orient, decide, act loop. He called it the OODA. He hated it when people said OODA. But I'm going to use it anyway because that's how most people are introduced to this. So the idea of the OODA loop is relatively simple. First, you observe the situation that you're in via the five senses. You've got to see where you're at before you can see where you want to go. Then you orient yourself. And this is the key to the OODA loop, and you'll see that in a minute. The orientation is the analysis and synthesis needed to form one's current mental perspective. So you need to have a pretty good idea of where you're at in order to predict where you are in the situation. Then you decide, you take a course of action based on your mental picture. and then you execute that action, and then the loop starts again. That's the simplicity of it, is that loop never stops. It occurs at different levels, at the strategic level, at the tactical level, and anywhere in between. You can use it in finance and business and advertising. People have used it for contract negotiations, on and on and on. And so it's quite the deal. But this is not Boyd's loop. This is the simplified elementary school version of a very complicated idea that he was trying to produce to get people to think. So let's take a look at what his loop looks like. This is what his loop looks like. And as you can see, you still have the 4 steps. You got the observe, the orient, the decide, the act. But each of these steps is quite involved. And look at the orient loop: combat traditions, synthesis and analysis, experience, new information, genetic heritage. He tied up a lot of science into making this decision system. And it's incredible. And you look, if you see feedback coming out of every one of them that could jumpstart you back to the observe stage at any point during the loop process. And this is something that is missed on the more simplified loop. You don't see the feedback process. So there's a lot of nuances that are involved with the loop. And so my idea was, I wonder if hackers themselves are using a version of the loop, something similar that could be compared, because we know the effectiveness of the OODA loop exists. There's been several studies on that. It's very effective in many different facets of life. So he made this loop out of an interdisciplinary model. And he used everything from literature to systems theory to thermodynamics, cognitive science, memes, social theory. He used tons of sources, all to polish this train of thought. So this model was already an interdisciplinary model. And that's what researchers and practitioners have been looking for on the study of hackers, as an interdisciplinary model. So that's what I went with. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the loop, there is a short exercise that we can conduct right here. And take a look at this. We have think of yourself in a speedboat in Florida. And then think about yourself skiing in the Alps, or driving a tank in some cool Arizona desert. That'd be kind of slick. They have those rentals out there that you can do that. And then think about when you learned how to ride a bicycle. Now, if you take all these ideas, these 4 separate ideas, and put them together in one central thought, and think about what you might come up with. And a lot of people, this is a hard exercise for them to conduct. Hackers come up with it right away. It's a snowmobile. You take those 4 disjointed ideas and you come up with a snowmobile. You got the treads from a tank, the skis from the skis, the engine from the outboard motor, and the saddle from the bicycle. Now let's take a look at what hackers do with this same sort of information. So we have a cell phone tower here. Looks like we got a couple of microwaves, some UHF, some VHF. Then we have Jeep Cherokee. Some of you are familiar with this instance that happened in 2015. Then you got the freeway. Then you got old cell phone technology. And then you have a laptop, which is the hacker sitting in his room. And so what does that produce? That produces a panic driver driving down the freeway. In case you haven't read about this, that the 2015 Jeep Cherokee hack is absolutely phenomenal. The hackers proved that through flaws in the cell phone network, flaws in the Jeep Cherokee's cybersecurity, that they could actually take control of the vehicle, blast music, squirt windshield wiper fluid, disengage the transmission, and in reverse, they had total control of the car, including acceleration and steering. So this is what the hackers did. They took all these disjointed items and they put it together into one comprehensive result, and their effectiveness was very good. So again, my research was to develop a whole new hacker theory, a starting point for researchers and practitioners to base their efforts on. And so I only had a simple research question, and it says, does hacker decision-making exhibit one or more patterns which can be developed into models for comparative analysis to the OODA loop? So I used a case study. Hackers are notoriously hard to perform research with. They're secretive. They don't like outsiders in the first place. So I had to use a case study for those hackers that would be willing to allow themselves to be studied. And even some of those that I studied wouldn't give me their real names. So it became a very interesting concept. So what I did was I used the Pacific Rim Collegiate Cyber Defense Challenge. If you're not familiar with the CCDC, it is a hacking competition nationwide. The Pacific Rim just happens to be one of the semifinals that they can go to. And in order to test the cyber defense of these college students, these college teams, they need a bunch of hackers to attack them. And they need to do it in a way that can be documented. And everybody gets attacked in the same manner. So I went to this, and I got to watch 40 some hackers over 3 days. And that was very informative. I actually allowed some of them to allow me to record their screen activities. I got like 28 of them that would allow me to record their screen activities, so that way I could do continuous analysis on them. And that was very, very revealing. And then I only got 4 who would participate in an interview, which is kind of what I expected, because as soon as you start talking, hey, you want to go on the record with something, they kind of go, no. And I didn't want to get into the prison stuff because that's a whole different research avenue, and I'm not doing that. So I only asked those 4 hackers, how did you achieve success during the contest? And they came up with some brilliant theories of how they achieved success. Most of it was because the defenders are stupid, but that doesn't really help us in decision making. But my results came up with 4 different models. And so those 4 different models, they came out and they seemed all separate, but they really weren't. They all came out to being resembling this model right here. Some hackers were further along in the process than others, and some weren't. So the models became tainted. But when I finally got this model built based on the interviews, based on the video, and based on constant analysis, by the way, watching people hack is not nearly as fun as doing the hacking yourself. And I probably watched those hundreds of videos. I don't know how many thousands of hours I spent watching them. Anyway, so if you look at this, at the research results, you can see this model that they follow roughly what the OODA loop does. They first scan the system. They got to know where they're at in the network. Then they use their experience to identify those target openings. None of them was able to go in cold. That was something that they all knew. They were like, oh, it's an XP machine. Oh, it's a Mac box. Oh, it's whatever. And they were able to use that orientation step to do 2 things, to either launch an attack or go back and try a different one. And they always did the low-hanging fruit, because none of them wanted to sit there all day going, oh, let's do a password crack. They all wanted to get something going now. If they were successful, the first thing they did was establish persistence, which was a decision they made. They said, I will establish persistence, and then later on I'll ruin their whole life. Or what they did at that point was they decided to reiterate the OODA loop again, or their decision-making model, and they started scanning at the next level. If they got through a firewall, they started over again. They did not take action against the target. They only established persistence and decided what to do next. So this very much similarly mirrors what the OODA loop is explaining. So it is similar to the 4-step OODA loop in that they only pretty much followed 4 different steps. But it's also similar to the full OODA loop, which involves going in depth and executing the OODA loop at the tactical as well as the strategic levels. what this does is, this is not, I don't believe that this is the answer. This is simply a starting point for further research, because there's no other reasonable theories out there. It's always more laws, more study of the people, or more technology. Or it's an case studies on how the technology failed, how the people failed, or how the law needs to be rewritten because somebody got through the loophole. And so the thing is this here is about how hackers think. We're no longer concerned with whether what they're doing is legal. We don't care what technology they're using is. We actually had one climb outside the building to peek in a window to see if he could get some passwords. He didn't. They actually had all gone to break, and then his arms got tired and he dropped to the ground. But the thing is he actually used other means than technology to try to get information. And here, you're targeting the core of the problem or the core of the situation. And what happens is that makes recommendations of future research important. So we need to repeat the study at other hacking contests. I was on the West Coast in Idaho. I'm now in New York teaching. So I'm trying to establish time when I have free time to do another repeat study to see, does this model hold water when it's a different group of hackers? There was a lot of limitations to using case study, but you got to generate theory from somewhere. The other thing that I'd like to do at some point is to do research using a focus group, a bunch of experts like yourself, to see, is this model, does it pass the common sense test? Does it pass the smell test of the experts that say, you know what, this seems reasonable? Or, oh my goodness, I can't believe you forgot that step. Because there's some things I can't observe, because what they're doing in their own head, I can't observe that. And so there's steps that could be missed. The other thing that'd be awesome to perform is to do a quantitative research. If I could get some hackers and specifically teach them and have them practice the OODA loop, it takes quite a while for people to start thinking. Because remember, they're doing this all by instinct. None of them knew about the decision-making model, any decision-making model. They never brought it up. So if you could specifically teach people that are doing something by instinct, a process to enhance that instinct, would that increase their effectiveness? It might. I kind of think it will, but hackers are a strange group. You're never quite sure what you're going to get. This whole research effort has deep implications. I actually paused my study for about 6 months because the implications are, do we really need better hackers out there? And the answer is no, but at the same time is you can't, squash knowledge. If it's not me, it's somebody. So we have a multidiscipline theory now that is established. At least it can be disproven or proven. We have a research direction other than those 3 stovepipes that we can go into. We have hackers that were oblivious to the actual process of structured thinking because they didn't mention it. They didn't say it influenced their decisions in any way. And so we have to think about, if they're trained, would that become an issue? The other problem is the OODA loop only works in offense, and cybersecurity doesn't perform offense. Everything is after the fact or to try to prevent the effect. And so that will never, ever that won't be effective. Anybody who uses the OODA loop wins every time. There is no effectiveness. What becomes an issue is you have to use, when 2 people are using the OODA loop, the one who uses it most effectively wins. So that brings us to that we need to maybe think about cyber defensive strategies and change those, which may include hacking back. I haven't really gone back into this very much, but I do know anecdotally, Kennesaw, Georgia, for those of you who aren't aware, it's a suburb of Atlanta, one of the top 10 violent cities in America. and it's a suburb of that, and it has an 80% reduction of violent crime of the U.S. average, not of Atlanta, but the average, including podunk towns. And one of the things that people attribute that to is the fact that they mandated a law, I think it was in '83, if I remember correctly, that every household have a gun so they can fight back. So it's pretty hard to conduct violent crime against somebody that wants to violent crime you back. Whether or not that would port well to cyber defense, I have no idea. It's something I've been thinking about ever since. Think about the implications of hackers using a structured thought. So really, the conclusion is that there's enough similarities between the hacker decision making and the OODA loop that there's further investigation is probably required. The hacker's stovepipe is still going to exist. You can't make the other conclusions without that fundamental research. So it's not going to stop. It's not going to replace anything. However, those things are not stopping hacker activities, but you can't fundamentally change what's going on. There is now a fourth avenue of exploratory research for practitioners and researchers. And there could be even more revealed if we start going into another direction. That's it for me. Again, my name is Matt Heath Van Horn. I'm a cyber warrior, retired, and now I'm assistant professor at SUNY Delhi. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Matt, thank you so much. John Checco here. I just wanted to say, I've heard about the OODA loop and in various different presentations. I like the history behind it. You actually presented it really well. I love the background on it, and the fact that it's OODA and not OODA, right? I appreciate that. So some of the questions I have, one is really about, and I think you answered this in part, but I'd kind of like to go more into, hackers using the OODA loop and then cyber defenders using the OODA loop. You get into that dogfight scenario. We're constrained in the corporate world by a lot of process, and so how do we effectively increase our OODA loop cycles?
Well, first of all, if there is no attack involved, we're only doing two of the steps, and which puts us always at a disadvantage, and defenders will never win. That's just the way it is. Everything we do when we report a crime, or we coordinate with agencies, or we coordinate the NOSCs and the NOCs and all those places, the thing is that's always after they got our data. We've lost. If they got our data, we lost. All the stuff after the fact is paperwork. In Boyd's mind of using the OODA loop, that none of that stuff matters. So the thing is really we have to be able to shoot back. If we can't shoot back, then we're never going to win. And I honestly, this is something I've been thinking about a long time, and I would love if I had a hacker group nearby rural New York so I could debate with some people, because maybe together we can come up with some ideas. But honestly, I don't know how we would effectively use the OODA loop in a defensive only posture.
Especially with just go back to Alan's presentation, with all the regulations and everything we have to report on, it becomes more and more difficult. At some point, you think you'd have to have like a skunk works type of operation or something that's legally separate from the organization that you can,
one of the ideas that I was playing with was what happens if we said the state of New Jersey, if you host your servers there, you can hack back if you're in New Jersey or any other state. Just pick one. Texas, they like guns. So the thing is we could measure that effectiveness. Would hackers avoid those corporations that actually could take a stance against them? But again, that would take a fundamental change in laws. That would take a fundamental, because cyber isn't just, it doesn't stop at the city or state border. It doesn't stop at a country's border. The invasion of Georgia back in the late 90s, that was a huge issue because that was predicted by a cyber attack. and it was actually a declaration of war according to NATO. They just didn't execute it. So that happens all the time. China attacks the U.S. all the time. So basically, thousands of times a day, they're declaring war on the U.S. and we do nothing. So I really don't know how we would effectively do that.
Okay, some questions in the chat. One is actually, can a hacker make a great cyber defender?
Absolutely.
They just need the right motivation, right? You don't want to have another Snowden.
Well, yeah, yeah, or a Mitnick,
Yeah.
which is a big problem with. So yes, an attacker can make a great defender. When I teach cyber defending, I start them off with lockpicking for physical defense, and then we move on from there to some very basic hacks. Because the thing is, if you don't teach them how to attack, they certainly don't know how to defend. They don't know why you're blocking these ports. They don't know why that, hey, how come it's not a good idea to, use these kind of tools unless you teach them how to do the attacks in the first place. And that's that experience, again, that helps with the the orientation phase of the OODA loop that is key to their success.
Okay, cool. Some other questions, I'm just going to combine some of the questions. So they talked about, there was a question about tabletop exercises and gaming, using gaming to try and teach defenders how to more effectively use the
absolute game theory, which is getting into little social sciences. I'm a computer science guy by trade, so social sciences to me is hokum. But the thing is that game theory is an effective tool for studying activities. I have not found any research that has used game theory or, any sort of that. Hackers play a lot of games. And so I kind of know where the question's coming from because I'm a gamer. All hackers, I don't know anybody that doesn't play a game. Video games, board games, Dungeons and Dragons, something to keep their minds occupied. And yes, that could give us an insight of how they think. But just like any other game, or even when you get into a different car, the way you drive that car is different. You don't drive a Jeep the same way you drive a Trans Am, or a semi the same way you drive a motorcycle. The principles are the same, but you inherently change your behavior. So that one could be a tough one to directly research, but I think it's worth at least a study.
So actually, that you spurred a question for myself, and this was in the chat. But I'm a big I won't say mathematician, but I know a lot about game theory and itself. So outside of gaming, game theory is a prisoner's dilemma. You've heard of it, right?
Yes, the prisoner's dilemma.
So how is can we use the prisoner's dilemma to disrupt the OODA loop?
I don't know. I've never tried that in practice before. I've only done it in the classroom or, sitting around and we're in a deployment line going, hey, let's do something. And, but that's an interesting, I wonder if we could set up an experiment using that.
And AI is perfect for that because you can get these AI machines to pit against each other.
It is. They're getting
better. The only structure we need is the scenario, right?
Yeah, that's really all we would need. And AI is getting better. I mean, I was just doing, I don't know if you guys play this one, Battle of Wesnoth, and they just updated the AI, and boy, it used to cheat, and now it doesn't cheat anymore. It's actually making good decisions, and I'm quite pleased with it. So now it's a hard, difficult game to play.
All right, so let's see if Mark is ready, and he's not on yet. So let me just check the sidebar here. I see no other questions. Cool. All right. If let's jump to John's presentation. Jolie, John, you can bring up your presentation, and Jolie, if you can switch to John's video. Thanks.
So are we good?
Now we are.
Good. Thanks, John, and good evening, everyone. Or hello from Paris. Though I spent a number of years in the New Jersey area, it feels like coming home almost, like the native son returning home to be able to join you this evening. I served for a time as the Chief Security Officer of Lucent, as we were headquartered there in Murray Hill, and then later as the head of security at Honeywell out there in Morristown. So participating this evening is, for me, somewhat like the native son coming home. I actually spent a decade in academia myself, thereafter a decade of service in the government, in the three-letter agencies, the FBI always paying my salary, but lending me to the CIA, DOE, DOD, and a number of other agencies, and then eventually migrating to the private sector where I've been for the last 20 years as in various roles as a chief security officer. But reflecting back over those times clearly brought to mind this old phrase, may you live in interesting times. Growing up, I always thought of that as a blessing. I hated being born, and the worst thing I could think of as being bored. It wasn't until recently some colleagues of mine pointed out that Robert Kennedy, in a speech he gave shortly before his death down in South Africa, actually referred to this phrase as an old Chinese curse. But whether we think of it as a curse or a blessing, what really characterizes these times is interesting in my mind is the pace and rate at which technologies are evolving and advancing, and particularly cyber. Tom Friedman, it's amazing as I think and reflect that it's already been a decade since he wrote his iconic work, The World is Flat. But we liked his book particularly well at Dell when I was there because he had a chapter on our supply chain innovative efforts. But I liked him particularly because he was, I think, one of the first writers to observe or opine that our age today would be characterized by the fact that traditional boundaries of interests would grow ever more porous, whether that's the one we draw between cyber and physical, domestic and international, public and private, church and state, business security, you name it, come up with any dichotomy, and we would see how in today's environment, cultural environment, the traditional boundaries are growing ever more porous. And of course, that porosity is being exacerbated now by what we call or is seen to evolve and be rolled out as the Internet of Things, or what I like to say or call the Internet of Everything, because I've noticed that part of the elements that are now joining that internet are not just the household appliances, the driverless cars, cameras, but also humans are actually connecting themselves to their brains to that internet. And I know humans usually take umbrage if they're ever referred to as a thing. So that's why I find myself referring it to the Internet of Everything. But with that growing connectivity and that Internet of Everything, we see that, of course, there's come an increase in the number of threat vectors, avenues of attacks open to the adversaries that we're up against. And of course, we in the security profession, particularly those of us, particularly Alan, I know you and I have been at this a long, long time. Those of us who've been in that business as long as we have always aspired to be proactively preventative in our efforts to do battle against those attacks, but have unfortunately found ourselves stymied in the world of reactive detection. We always aspire to be that proverbial fence at the top of the hill, but almost inevitably found ourselves at the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff after the damage was done. And of course, those memories and those efforts aren't always something we like to reflect on and remember. My training as an undergraduate was in philosophy, and one of my favorite philosophers was George Santana, who reminds us that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I think there's perhaps no more dramatic instances of the importance of remembering than perhaps, again, what we can draw following Matt's example from a war situation back in World War I or World War II, when the Nazis started launching their threats via the flying bomb towards Europe or England. And the response was that of reactive detection. Post-execution, they would launch the V-1, and we had our barrage balloons up, our anti-aircraft guns. We even sent some poor Spitfire pilots up there to try and knock those suckers off course. All of that was very resource intensive, very complex, very expensive, and ultimately ineffective. Of course, with the advent of the next generation of threats that really showed the inadequacies of our first approach, the V-2 rocket, we finally got it right and turned our attention to what we call proactive prevention, where in Operation Crossbow, we started to actually target and focus in pre-execution on the site of construction and launch of those V-2 rockets. And it's at that point that the tide really began to turn for us. So we have this historical record, this historical lesson of why it's important, notwithstanding the pull and the attraction and the stymied way in which we feel we have to stay in the reactive detection zone, the importance of moving as quickly and as whenever possible into that proactive prevention space. Now, of course, my personal introduction to the world of reactive occurred quite early on in my professional career. I finished a law degree, an MBA, and reached a conclusion that I wanted to head towards academia, Matt, where you are now, and decided I would pursue a PhD in a critical field of study upon which the stability of the universe teeters at this very moment. Wait for it. Hermeneutics. It's a hodgepodge of psychology. If I were looking at everybody's face, and I can't see them now, I'd probably see a lot of glaring looks, or I get a lot of deer in the headlights looks when I mention hermeneutics. It's a hodgepodge of psychology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, and linguistics, all woven together in a way that looks at the variables around which human beings construct or interpret their world. If it hadn't been for the fact that the FBI got it in their mind that they needed a hermeneuticist, I was pretty sure that they didn't. We had an extensive debate on that topic. At the end of the day, they said, look, we've got a testing instrument that includes 4 months of training at Quantico. If you're not right for our organization, that instrument will kick you out. I said, well, look, I just finished an MBA where I studied these testing instruments. I'm not sure I have that same confidence, but okay, the gauntlet's down. Let's do it. At the end of 4 months, I was walking across the stage. They handed me a weapon and a badge and promptly sent me out to Los Angeles, where they were about to invoke a new model of going up against terrorism called the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The TV buffs out there might remember the show 24, Jack Bauer and his team. This was the group upon which that TV show was predicated. But I remember showing up there, and I could see the Jack Bauers placing bets under the table at just how long this hermeneuticist was going to last. And even though, and I admire these men and women greatly, even though they desire to be proactively preventative, one of the things I noticed almost immediately is that we were in the reactive mode. We worked Lockerbie, the plane that was brought down over to Scotland. For those that were younger in our midst may not remember that, but we worked that case. Oklahoma City bombing, after it had already happened, chased the perpetrator of that heinous act. And I was one of many who can claim that I unsuccessfully chased the Unabomber, all in a reactive mode. But I told myself, well, look, this is in the physical world. When we finally move off into the cyber realm, by golly, things are going to change. And then one day the boss came into the bullpen and shouted out, hey guys, who here knows anything about Unix? Now, I grew up in Libya before the 6-Day War. My dad was a pilot. I lived out amongst the Arab kids on the edge of the Sahara. And I remember them, even at that time, talking about the 6,000 Libyan warriors that went up against Pharaoh in battle. Those that were not killed were all castrated and sent home as eunuchs. Well, I said to myself, I don't know what the rest of these mopes may know about Unix, but I'm anxious to show value as a hermeneuticist. I raised my hand. The boss plopped the file down and says, McClurg, don't screw this up. National security is involved. So I opened the book or the file and started looking for that eunuch. Didn't see him anywhere. Never did find him, in fact. There was a whole bunch, however, about Unix, the operating system upon which the phone systems, the Bell-Cor's phone systems were predicated, and was that which a young phreaker, which is a hacker that targets the phone system, a young phreaker by the name of Dark Dante, had gone after. He was supposedly a rehabilitated hacker as a young man. We'd hired him to work some of the war games, support the war games of the military, and he apparently returned to his old behaviors. He was actually breaking into Pac Bell offices at night and stealing passwords, equipment, Bell-Core manuals, taking it home, studying it to the wee hours of the morning, and then advancing a far more sophisticated cyber attack than he ever would have been able to do, but for the 30-year-old rusty lock of the central office's phone office door. He had digitized a photo of himself picking that 30-year-old rusty lock with his grandfather's pick set. And once he gained access, of course, he leveraged that to then advance and do damage in a way that he wouldn't have been able to do but for that physical vulnerability. And the flip side of that coin was already starting to emerge in the eyes of the task force, because we saw in the SCADA systems that controlled the water, the power of the systems of Los Angeles, these SCADA systems had cyber vulnerabilities, which when exploited would undermine a physical vulnerability. This was well before Stuxnet and the lessons that we learned from that, from the Iranian nuclear compromise. But in these early days in Los Angeles, that side of the coin was already starting to emerge. And it dawned on me, hey, this is the future we're looking at here, where we'll see a growing number of interdependencies between cyber and physical and cyber, and that the adversaries will look to exploit those interdependencies. And that the way we can optimally position ourselves to perhaps do battle in this space was to converge these historically siloed programs. Cybersecurity over here, physical security over here, bringing them together under one operational umbrella where we might be less likely, though there's no guarantee of overlooking those interdependencies. The FBI started actually sending me on the road. I did a little road show for a couple of years, championing the lessons learned as a result of the Dark Dante case. A lot of the corporations in America were clapping their hands and saying, yes, this makes sense. But I noticed very few of them were actually developing these converged house model. PwC had listened to me present, and they came up to me and said, John, don't worry, that the model's right. There's just not enough of you quite yet that feel comfortable straddling both worlds in order to advance converged models. I thought to myself, well, wow, how comfortable do you have to really feel? I'm the guy, after all, who thought it was a eunuch. But he said, give it some time. And I've continued to monitor the Fortune 500, particularly the large businesses there in the New York, New Jersey area. A lot of the Fortune 500 are indeed moving or migrating gradually to these converged organizational structures where physical and cybersecurity are managed hand in glove under one operational umbrella. Shortly after I did battle with Dark Dante, bad news broke back in Washington that Aldrich Ames had been spying for the Russians for years. The FBI and the CIA took black eyes because of that, because it was found that if we'd only played better together, we could have caught Nicholson at least years earlier and maybe saved the 10 lives of the assets that we lost. President Clinton particularly was irritated and signed an executive order that basically gave counter-espionage responsibilities to the FBI. The FBI promptly put two of us in what I call light cover at the CIA to advance or take control or management of this counter-espionage program. We knew there was yet another spy. We also knew there were like 300 of the CIA personnel who had not yet resolved their polygraphs. That was an aspect of the Ames case that came to light, that if we'd actually focused on that a little earlier, we may have in fact caught Aldrich a little sooner. So by day, my job was to look at these unresolved polygraphs, and by night it was to look and find out who the next or the other spy was. Actually, out of a short list of individuals, a guy by the name of Harold Jim Nicholson emerged. We actually followed him to Singapore, where he was going on vacation, or at least so he claimed. On his first day of vacation, spent the entire day walking around town, looking in the pane glass windows of the department stores that make up the downtown Singapore area. Boy, I thought, man, I'm even more fun than that on my vacation. But clearly what he was doing is what we know in the industry as dry cleaning. He wasn't looking at what was behind the pane glass. He was looking for reflections in the glass, looking to pick up on that surveillance. And at the end of the third day, a big black limo pulled up to the curb, the door opened up, and Jim hopped in. We looked down at the license plate, Russian embassy. We had our spy. But having our spy and being able to convict him were two different things. We then had to figure out where are we going to place this guy while we build the case against him. Now, remember, this is pre-9/11. And so we decided we'd put him in the counterterrorism center out at CIA. We managed to manipulate him in a way that he hired a deputy who was in on it and knew what he was up to. And so we leveraged, his name was John. We leveraged John extensively in trying to watch and follow Jim's activities. But almost immediately, I noticed Jim survey the physical and cyber environments of the agency and figure out which of the two he was going to exploit in trying to advance his activities. Neither of those worlds were done in a very shoddy manner. Both the cyber and the physical were top drawer operations. CIA was one of the first to deploy digital rights management. And of course, the physical security, Hollywood's had a fun time with the different controls that the agency has out there. Ultimately, Jim decided it was in the physical realm that he would best succeed, and he would proceed to take pictures with an old-fashioned camera of what the Russians wanted, put it in his pocket, and walk it out past the guards who were not doing body searches. Of course, what Jim didn't know is that we had a fiber optic camera in that little pinhole up in the ceiling that was taking pictures of him taking pictures, and it was that information that we ultimately eventually used to convict Jim. That and the information we were able to pull off his laptop one night after we had sent him on a bogus mission to Europe. We put his van on a flatbed, moved it into a Quonset hut so the odometer wouldn't move at all, and managed to come up with his laptop and did a quick image and forensics job on that laptop. We'd made some progress since my time working Dark Dante, but we're able to find on that laptop a tasking order from his Russian handler. So that really closed the lid on Jim as far as his spying activities. But it showed that relationship between the physical and the cyber that he played and he exploited. He's famous because he's also known to have 10 years later, as he was sitting in prison, recruiting his own son to resume the spying of the family. If you'd like to see more about that, CNN recently did a declassified version of the whole affair called The Spy's Son, and you can watch that. And I understand Paramount Pictures has even picked up the movie rights. Nicholson is going to be played by De Niro, apparently, and the son will be by Shia LaBeouf. And, well, me, I'm not sure. I've heard Matt Damon thrown out there, but we'll see. They'll probably do an abstracted character there so they don't have to pay me any money. But it was that combination of experiences that further solidified in my mind this paradigm of the physical and the cyber coming together under one umbrella. After the success out of the CIA, the FBI actually pulled me back into headquarters. And Alan Brill, I think you'll maybe remember these days, Ken Guidey and I helped pull together the CTAC, the first cyber center for the FBI. We knew where the future was going and that we needed to get ourselves positioned to do battle there. It wasn't shortly thereafter, though, that the FBI lent me to DOE to support DOE's efforts in the first CI cyber office that they created. They were pulling together their supercomputers in one huge network, and that seemed to be going well until I asked them one day, well, who do we intend to use all this power? They looked at me kind of in a puzzled way and said, well, the computer science departments of America, of course. So, well, when was the last time you visited one of those? Matt, you sit in one of them, I guess, now. I said, the last time I visited them, a lot of the students are foreign nationals who are on the export control list. We got to rethink what we're going to do here. In fact, that was quite disturbing, and I'm not sure they ever resolved that. I got pulled away and enticed by Bell Labs Lucent that was being jettisoned from AT&T to join them as their first CSO. They asked me, hey, we've heard about your converged model, physical and cyber under one umbrella. Can you really do that? I said, well, that's a good question. I sure think I can. And the opportunity is enticing, particularly since right now, having come up through the ranks of the FBI at a pace that no one had really planned on, there was no set cyber path at the time. I had reached the ceiling of the SES service, and the Bureau was telling me John, you're just too young. I said, look, guys, I'm your attorney. I've taught you better than that. You can't say it that way. You have to say my knowledge, skills, and abilities aren't right for the SES. I said, well, we're not going to tell you that. I said, well, let's just leave it alone. The private sector wants to try the model. I'm going to go and we're going to see if we can make it work. And that was a shock because up until that time, there weren't many people who would ever leave the Bureau before they hit their full 20. They said, boy, you're really going to take a risk. And it dawned on me as I reflected on this life I was going to now assume in the private sector, that the chances of my not succeeding were not inconsequential. There was already a sense and an appreciation of the anemic performance of signature-based. And Jeff, you began this morning or this afternoon talking about signature-based viruses. So there was already an appreciation of the anemic performance of that mode of protection. And that because of that, it was probably not if, but when I was going to get compromised out in the private sector. It was then a little voice went off in my head. I remembered some training I got in my MBA program. Remember this? It says, under promise, over deliver. I said, well, I need to massage the expectations of my leadership here very quickly, or my FBI buddies will be having the laugh last as I get fired quickly after jumping to the private sector. So I explained and I massaged the expectations of the leadership to understand that given these variables, particularly the anemic, weak performance of signature-based antivirus, that it was not if, but when we were going to get compromised. And sure enough, both at Lucent and subsequently later at Honeywell, where I left after Lucent, we were indeed compromised in each of those companies, and in large part because of the anemic performance of signature-based antivirus. And that's notwithstanding the fact that I had gone to great lengths to create what we call a defense in depth structure. That philosophy of defense in depth was only just emerging at the time, but it really made sense. If you think of the kill chain analogy, and that's also a mode of speaking that's emerged in recent years, but high up in the kill chain was always positioned this antivirus partner. If they were going to fail you and perform in such a poor manner up high in that kill chain, then it was going to necessitate a structure that had some depth to it, so that as it failed at one level, you can have hopes that subsequent lower levels would catch and contain the adversary. It was very complex. It was very costly. It was reactive. It was post-execution. And ultimately, as I could bear testimony to, ultimately ineffective. Clearly, a new paradigm was required. After I experienced those compromises at Honeywell, when I left or at Lucent, I left for Honeywell, where we were convinced that we were going to implement the same converged house again in a very different business, an old-fashioned manufacturing organization. And as I arrived there, it was the summer that a lot of the oil companies in Texas were being hit by APT. And I thought, wow, here is Honeywell. We're about to go up in negotiations with the Chinese to discuss the building of a platform that will go up against Airbus, Boeing in the aviation environment. And I said, if there's anyone who should be on that victim list right now, it should be us. But I had a hermeneutics problem. As I would go and look at the logs and try and interpret them and look for anything pernicious or insidious in the logs, I couldn't see it. I couldn't see my gut was telling me it had to be there. It was shortly thereafter that I got a call from my buddies back at the FBI saying, hey, John, we've been looking at a Chinese bot master for some time now under the proper authorization of a FISA court order, which is topical for today's discussions. But we've been watching this, and we have to tell you that we've noted that one of the boxes that emanates out regularly to this Chinese bot master falls within your network. I said, well, there you have it. I knew we had to be on the victim list, and sure enough, there you are. So I had to take that long walk. It's always up to the third floor or higher, up to the executive suite, to let them know that once again, remember when I told you it was not if, but when? Well, it's not if, it's when. It's happened. And to the credit of the leadership of the Honeywell team, instead of telling me to bring it down right away, which is what historically the reaction of leadership is, they said, John, you've got 3 months to find out just how badly and deeply they've hurt us. I said, wow, that 3 months was the longest 3 years of my life. And it was humbling. It was humbling, not so much because of the prowess of the compromise. It was tied to malware, a spear phishing attack. And then after they got in, they do what they always do. They go as deep as they can, and they go for the super user, as the powerful user. So all those things were elements of this attack. But what really scared me and humbled me was the fact that we determined that they'd actually gotten in 2 years earlier. And that once in, they'd shut down and gone silent and waited for 2 years for what they knew was that upcoming negotiation. And in the eve of that negotiation, resurrected it and launched it against the members of that negotiating team. That kind of discipline is what scared me to death. And so after some time, we figured we had them figured out. We'd had the back doors closed or ready to be closed. And the question was, well, when do we bring these suckers down? Well, there was a lot of debate about that. Some wanted to demarche the Chinese. I said, look, my cousin's the ambassador over there, and we just saw the Brits try that a few weeks ago, and all they got for their trouble was, no, not us. You had a Dark Dante, we have a Dark Dante. And that's true. The Chinese do have Dark Dantes. And when I was chasing Dark Dante, I know that when I was chasing him, he was always looking over his shoulder, trying to figure out, where we were and what we were doing, how close we were to catching him. He was also always trying to figure out how to just stay alive. It's hard to make a living when you've got the full force of the FBI on your tail. In his case, he had the power to seize the phone lines of any business in Los Angeles. And in this case, he targeted the Los Angeles radio station, I think it was FM 107, who was giving away 2 brand new Porsches that summer to the 107th caller. Well, Dark Dante was the 107th caller in both of those instances and won both Porsches and promptly sold them for cash so he could live on that. What the boy didn't realize was that constitutes money laundering in Los Angeles. And Dark Dante actually did more jail time for money laundering than he actually did for the cyber things that I got him on at that time. But it taught me that that's the way they live and then they react. So I said, well, look, Chinese New Year is coming up. If we bring this down right in the middle of Chinese New Year, if it's indeed a Chinese version of Dark Dante, he'll probably or she'll probably respond immediately. If, on the other hand, it's members of the PLA, who I call hackers and who were not limited in the resources they had to throw at me, but if indeed it were PLA members enjoying one of the most important holidays of the Chinese culture, it's very possible that the reaction won't occur until that next Monday when government employees come back from enjoying their holiday. So we brought it down. Absolute silence. Not a cyber whimper till that next Monday when all hell broke loose as they were trying and scrambling, looking for their back doors and whatever. So again, I don't share that with this group particularly as another anecdote that we needed to tell us that, you know, what we're up against here in this battle is nothing less than the full force and power of a nation state that's coming at us. And that, you know, it's in that environment that we have to be aware of the biases and prejudices that we bring to the environment as we do battle there. Shortly thereafter is when Michael Dell got a hold of me. He, as many of you know, he came back out of retirement and transformed his company, which was a box maker, into an end-to-end IT scalable solutions company. And in that process, woke up one night in a cold sweat. He had an epiphany, basically, and suddenly realized that embedded across this spectrum of IT solutions were security vulnerabilities, which, if unaddressed, could kick the credibility legs out from under his sales team that were trying to sell those solutions. A lot of those solutions were security solutions. He is turning himself into a security company as well. So he asked me if I wouldn't come, establish that converged house of physical and logical. I could bring my penchant for dealing with the insider threat piece that continued to plague and bog my mind because it puzzled me, and particularly in the wake of Snowden, when the government came out and said that all companies wishing to do business with them at the end of 2016 would have to show they had up and functioning what they called a viable insider threat program. Now, they didn't define or say what viable meant. We all sort of had to make that up as we had to go along. It was an act of hermeneutics again. I said, whatever they're ultimately going to say it means, it's going to probably have to show or involve the demonstrated use of what we call big data analytics, which were starting to emerge and which were really the first hint to me professionally that maybe my life stymied in the world of reactive detection might be coming to the end, that the possibility of leveraging AI's machine learning and mathematical algorithms was perhaps on the cusp of the horizon, something we could use. We surely knew we had to do better. I mean, back in the middle of the revolution, George Washington was apparently interviewed by members of the inquiring press, and they came up to George and said, "Hey, George, what keeps you up at night?" To which George is reported to have said it wasn't the Congress, the Continental Congress, which even then seemed incapable of doing anything very productive, nor was it his soldiers who were at that moment starving and freezing to death out in Valley Forge. George's answer as to what kept him up at night was they're spies. And for 240 years, we in the United States have been amassing an understanding and appreciation of these early data sets that should be indicators, hints or clues to us as to who might be that next spy. And yet, notwithstanding those 240 years and those various sources of data, we've only ever been able to play catch up. We've only ever been able to send a mope like myself in after the spy after he's already done us dirty. And it occurred to me that the reason we were stymied in reactive detection versus prevention in the area of espionage was because it was a big data problem. The early indicators were just too numerous and distributed across too many repositories for us to wrap our cognitively limited human carbon-based minds around. And that it wasn't until we developed software that allowed us to mine that data that fed into all those different repositories in these diverse environments that we were able to finally come up and start to make some strides. In fact, in that regard, we pulled together a big data analytical tool, Katanga and Statistica, both looking at structured and unstructured data. We pulled that together and gathered some samples from our federal program at Dell. In fact, we even tweaked the identity of or the profile of the director of that program in such a way that if indeed the algorithm worked, it would kick his name out as that individual about whom we should be most concerned. A couple of weeks into the program, the team came walking towards me and they had these very disturbed looks on their face. I said, "What's the matter? Is the pilot not working?" They said, "No, boss, the pilot's working, but what's concerning us is that according to it, the person about whom we should be most concerned is our boss." I said, yes, with a big smile on my face. And they kind of pulled back and said, we've been debating what would perhaps be your reaction to this news. And then we have to tell you that was not even on the radar. I said, well, I let them know what we had done. We had tweaked the identity, but that it really brought home with force the new power and strength that we were on the eve and the verge of actually wielding in this environment. In fact, it pulled me up short. It caused me to pause and say, wait a minute, I'm not sure we've really thought through all the ethical implications of having this kind of strength. Some of our people in our federal program had clearly signed up for that kind of scrutiny, but our employees who grew up in the former East Germany and had lived under the oppressive arm of the Stasi had never surely signed up for that. And I don't care how amiable and nice I may try and be with them, they're never going to buy my protestations that they can trust me as their big brother not to abuse that power. It's really a case, I think, where we're going to have to see that generation almost pass away before we can enter an environment where really the premium or the preference is going to be put on what we call contextual richness, and perhaps less the privacy that we hear so frequently discussed today. The millennials and their penchant for contextual richness want to, or would rather have it so when they arrive late at a hotel at night, the hotel knows that your favorite comfort food is spaghetti bolognese, and that if it's raining and the possibility of your meetings the next day being delayed or the traffic being heavy, that they would make your wake-up call 30 minutes earlier and call for your car to take you to your meetings just that much earlier. All of that coming together seamlessly in a way that it enriches the context of your life, and in a way that isn't cavalier or throws security to the wind, but it's just a different focus and an area of emphasis. And it's, again, borne out by a cultural practice that you see every day as you look at what the millennials will post out on social media, that beguiling specificity that is so often harvested and used against them. But clearly in the wake of our insider threat pilot, we proved to the organization that security was no longer a distasteful cost of doing business. We had now become an indispensable and inextricable aspect of advancing it. Indispensable because, well, inextricable because it was tied to a law. Indispensable because we delivered a solution, the cost of which was competitive in comparison to what Bob Moore, my buddy over at HP, was doing it. So we became indispensable because we added to the competitive price of the solution, and inextricable because we tied it to a law or regulation that kept us in the game. We were no longer just the guns, gates, guards, and geeks of yesterday. We are now effectively a duty owed by all. And when I say all, I do mean the wetware. And we're all probably familiar with the wetware. We've dealt with the hardware and the software over the years, and that's been challenging enough. That's really what's really always been a challenge ultimately for me. And I think this is what we mean when we talk, Alan, you talk about it being the people. On top of a person's shoulder is this orb. And on top of this orb is this mind that's 90 or 78% water. And it's the way in which that wetware can be beguiled, harvesting the specificity that our spouses or we even personally post out on social media can get beguiled in a spearfishing attack because of that specificity. In fact, such a thing happened to one of my employees whose little daughter was about to have her last game of the season. She's a cute little bug, but the fact of the matter is she can't play with beans. She'd never scored. So he told his wife, look, I've got to get this project done. Take her to her game. I'll get the project done. They go away. 2 hours later, they come back and the house erupts into chaos. Not only did the little bug score, she scored the winning goal. Now, his wife goes immediately to Facebook and posts that meaningful, memorable event in their daughter's life out on Facebook. My employee, of course, feels terrible. He is forever a horrible father who missed this singular event in his daughter's life. He comes Monday morning with his project. He turns it in. I give him the appropriate accolades, but it rings hollow when he thinks about what he missed out that weekend. He gets back to his desk, and one of the first emails he sees is, here's a picture of your daughter kicking the winning goal at last Saturday's soccer game. Now, it doesn't matter that he's a security professional. What comes down to is that at the end of the day is that he is first and foremost a guilt-ridden father, a human. And as Alan and Jeff and others have pointed out already this morning or this afternoon, it's the human aspect that the bad guys or the hackers really know how to exploit and use. And that's what they do here. And so he will, in the end, click as he knows he shouldn't have. And the malware will, of course, take its effect, resulting in that, once again, why it's not if, but when. And the question of the discussion then will turn, hopefully, if you've managed the expectations of the leadership, not to just being summarily fired, but instead a discussion of, one, how well were the assets critically identified? How well were those assets then enclaved? How well did we detect the compromise when it did come? And then how well and effectively did we contain it? It's now, I guess, measured in terms of what we call mean time to detection. How well did we expel it? And then this has become critical. How well did we leverage the new insights gained in raising the bar so that the next time it comes, they'll have a harder time at it. And with only 19% at the time, and maybe sometimes up as around 50% of the time, signature-based antivirus catching the malware or the viruses, we knew that next time was coming, which again gives way to that defense in depth structure that I and those of my age and generation have had to build in the corporations. These defense in depth complex structures that involve detection, incident response, triage, damage mitigation, and remediation. That defense in depth and that inevitability, that pessimism and that inevitability of compromise is also what has informed the formulation of some of the standards we're now seeing unfolded, like the NIST, where 3/4 of the elements of that whole model has as the unspoken presupposition that you will be compromised. So how well can you detect and respond and mitigate and repair and recover after that compromise is such a part of our culture that it's woven its way into that. And with 90% of all breaches being tied to malware, and that's the figure that the latest, or I guess it was 2 years ago, the Verizon report said that all breaches that we can identify, 90% of them are attributable to malware. If we could only finally get our act together when it came to antiviruses and battle there, 90% of the problem would be handled. We could turn our attention to the 10%, which is things like insider threat and other very challenging things. So we knew something had to happen, something new needed to come along. And in fact, it was predicted by Thomas Kuhn, the American physicist and philosopher, who predicted 50 years ago in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that periods of normal science are interrupted by revolutionary science. New paradigms change the rules of the game and our standards and our best practices. So the frustration that's been building in the community presaged the actual arrival of what Thomas Kuhn predicted. And in fact, at Dell, about three years ago, we reached that point, that saturation point. Our CTO over in the endpoint business said, hey, look, I've had it. No more sacrificial lambs. No more always having one victim from whom we could get that initial virus and then build the antivenom based on that sacrificial lamb. What he did is he went to an organization we had recently purchased called SecureWorks and asked them to pull together a bundle of evil that we hadn't seen in the cyber world before. We had a physical equivalent in Atlanta at the Center for Disease Control, but a cyber equivalent I'm not sure we'd ever seen. That this was a collection of over 4,100 instances of 0 days malware pieces that he could then throw against 60 different solutions that he had scanned the entire international environment community, came up with 60 players who all claimed to be the next best thing in antivirus. And against these 60s, he in turn launched this collection of 4,100 instances of 0 days ransomware and malware. And out of that bunch, one little unknown startup by the name of Cylance emerged with a 99.7% kill rate. Blew everybody away. The CTO was excited. Michael Dell got excited. They retested several times and continually got the same result. And Michael, I think, even tried to buy the company, but we'd just gone private, and he spent $22,000 million going private, and I maybe played it a little too cheaply. But in the end, he opted for the next best thing and signed an exclusive OEM relationship with the company and embeds that now in everything he offers the enterprise. Now, at this same time, and this is when I was just finishing up my insider threat test, the Dell team came back to me because I had sent them looking as soon as I arrived at Dell for the Chinese. I said, look, if we do business in the global marketplace, we compete against a state-owned enterprise, and we have intellectual property that would bolster the position of that state-owned enterprise in the marketplace, then they're either here or they're going to be here. Start looking. So they had gone off and started looking, and just at about the time I'm hearing this news of this solution called Cylance, my team's coming back and telling me, look, we found the Chinese, we expelled them, we've raised the bar in understanding of how they got us. They exploited the fact that our two-factor authentication wasn't as robustly deployed as it needed to be, and they had gone after my super users again. So I needed to bolster the security around my super users and my two-factor authentication. I built my roadmap. I had my plan. I was a man with a mission. I didn't need any distraction, particularly BS distractions like this. I knew this had to be BS because I bore the wounds of almost 15 years of anemic signature-based antivirus, and I knew this just couldn't be true. So I grabbed my ops team said, take this BS solution in the back, run what the Chinese just defeated us with, and when it fails, come back and tell me so I can tell Michael and these guys, and they'll stand down and leave me alone while I stay focused on this new roadmap. Because I promised Michael, look, anything you're going to sell to the outside world, I will make sure we deploy internally, so I don't kick the credibility legs out from under your salespeople. And that meant I would be obliged to deploy this BS solution too, unless I could prove it was BS. 2 days later, the teams came walking back towards me. And these are the ops guys. These are the guys you never let have offices above the first floor because it's harder to commit suicide, right, on anything higher than the first floor. They come back, they're walking towards me, and they've got smiles on their faces. I thought, what is this? What's this about? I said, what? And he said, boss, we don't know what to tell you. But if we'd had this deployed, we would not have lost Christmas. That infrastructure that we're yet building out further now with greater cost and complexity and resources wouldn't be necessary because it would have stopped pre-execution the virus from ever having launched in the first place. The solution determines whether or not a file is good or bad purely by the information that it contains in the file, and is capable of replicating that understanding and growing that on an ongoing basis. And then it does that because we determined that there was patterns that have emerged in files and how they're just constructed over the years of the development and emergence of the internet. They basically, our mathematicians, mined what we call the good files and then the bad files and extracted out of the good files the millions of attributes that make them good and the millions of attributes that make the bad file bad, attached an integer value to that can then be ported over into a math model, an algorithm that can sit on the endpoint using very little footprint. Most DAT files now that sustain signature-based antiviruses are so large that they become the end user's computer becomes a boat anchor more than anything else. And when it's updating, heaven forbid you have anything you need to get done that day because the CPU consumption goes way down and your machine becomes very ineffective. But if this very little CPU consumption occurs, very little space on the machine is required. And in fact, you don't even have to update it like you also often do with a signature-based solution, which is very, very important given the way humans often deploy and act when it comes to updating their signatures. Humans are simply incapable of keeping up. And again, these predictive patterns allows us to differentiate between the safe and the bad files to the tune of this 99.7% effective rate. So it's the artificial intelligence without being explicitly programmed, the assistance that without the intervention of humans that allows this accelerated engagement and is providing a disruption to the industry unlike anything I've seen in the last 2 decades. And again, and Alan, I think of all the things we've seen over the years of our engagement in the industry, that we've seen a lot of things come and go, but there's something about this that tells me that it has some sticking power to it. The future of malware, even though prevention, even though we in the security industry weren't the first ones, I mean, healthcare and insurance and high frequency trading embraced AI and machine learning well in advance of us, but hey, we finally have gotten there. And I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of the pace at which we got there, but we now have it and can leverage it to the tune that it now has demonstrated itself capable of acting. And that it won't just be in the area of antivirus that we can wield this power. If you think of the other challenges, and some of them we've already mentioned this afternoon, the distributed denial of services, but clearly also passwords and identity. We're talking what we call continuous authentication, where the same power and strength that will extract and leverage the value and understanding it has of those millions of attributes that make a file good, can at the same time extract those same attributes about each of us as a human being and make it such that there will be a time when my granddaughter will come up to me and say, Grandpa, was it really the case that at one time you had to enter an alphanumeric sequence in order to gain access to your computer? And it'll be that foreign to us as we continue to see these things unfold. So basically what I say we've done is we've mapped the genomic structure of the internet, which allows us to predict and then block pre-execution in real time these viruses, no matter how they may try to tweak and change them. And that's why signatures are so easily to get around. Is all you have to do is morph or pack the signature just in the slightest. And the bad guys will do this with the tools that they can get out on the dark web in instances like Satan, where you have a ransom as a service being provided, where you can actually tweak and change and alter the ransomware right there on the spot to the point that you're assured that it'll circumvent any form of currently existing signature-based antivirus. So That's what we've got in place and have been working. You may have become and heard about this through the release of the congressional report chronicling the OPM breach. We don't usually talk about our customers, but the OPM congressional report called out that it was indeed silence and the way in which we leverage AI and machine learning that enable us to determine that, in fact, that organization was still compromised even after they've been declared clean by signature-based assessments. So again, this approach also leverages and liberates a lot of resources when you think of all that's involved in updating DAT files, the triage, the classification, and the testing in production and out of production systems. And then, it can take weeks at times to get that file updated. All that process and time is now being extracted and liberating those resources. Clearly, I tell my friends and my peers, I feel like I'm Bill Murray in the Groundhog Day. I thought I was trapped in this never-ending cycle of reactive detection, never to see the light of day when it comes to proactive detection. But I can say with confidence that I believe and know the groundhog is dead. He was impaled by a cyber lance that was driven by AI and machine learning, and will drive and infuse new life into our profession. I've seen it already. But as in any case, I don't believe that this new solution will lose its efficacy over time like we've seen so many other solutions. And that was recently borne out by an SE Labs report that through the worst that 2016, 2017, 2018 put at us in the way of malware, they went back to our 2015 version of the math model. We call her Infinity. We threw the worst that we did in those 3 years at her as she existed in 2015. And the result is that the end user would have been protected even if they hadn't updated their model for over 2 years. That's as much as 33 months on average of a predictive advantage. That's like the Minority Report, the movie that many of you may be familiar with, actually moving from the world of fiction to being real with a 22 to 33 month predictive advantage. Clearly, it's a dawn of a new age. There was Galileo it was Copernicus that first proposed the heliocentric model of the universe. He had the good sense to die shortly thereafter, and it was poor Galileo that had to champion that model. We're not naive or keenly aware of what we're going to face as we propose a new paradigm. And that's why I say in the heat of battle that's now emerged, and you can see it. You hear so many people out there now, everybody's saying, hey, we do AI, we do machine learning. There's a fog of battle that's now created that it's hard to penetrate if you're a consumer or an enterprise. And that's why at the end of the day, I say, don't be beguiled by someone who exudes the enthusiasm I do for something such as this. I say, prove for yourself the power and strength of the solution. Finally, as a sort of a parting note, I had to make reference to the comments recently made by Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, and Elon Musk. I think all three of them have issued what I call clarion calls of caution when it comes to the engagement and embrace of AI and machine learning. To that, I would only say, well, look, any new technology has always been a two-edged sword, one that carries with the possibility of being leveraged in some untoward way. It's only by taking a deep breath, stepping back, and constantly adjusting as the adversaries do that we will, I think, still enjoy a competitive lead ahead of those adversaries and be able to truly appreciate the fruits that this new technology will afford for our industry. So much so that when the next time I meet all of you, when I'm back from Paris and I run into you in New York and I come up and say, may you live in an interesting time, there won't be a doubt in any of your minds that which I pronounced upon you was not indeed a cursing, but a new paradigm benediction. John, I think with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, John. I'll open it up for questions. We'll wait a minute or two. Because again, with the delay in the streaming, but question I had for you was basically, can this be more seen as instead of user behavior analysis, application behavior analysis?
Yeah, I get the way I would contrast it against those is the time at which a lot of that behavior analysis happens is post-execution. The bad guy has already acted or is advancing his ill-gotten gains or his plan against you, where this is actually preempting pre-execution almost before you have the substance that you would normally want to wrap your analytical mind around. It looks at the genomic code and stops pre-execution the virus from ever launching. Even if it's just been packed maybe seconds before, it doesn't matter. It's still capable of identifying that. And if it's an instance where, let's say, they had a completely blank slate and there was no lingering genetic code that would have triggered it as possibly being evil or statistically leaning towards the dark side. The time and speed at which to capture that new variant and update the math model is just a fraction of the time and the processes that are associated with the old signature approach.
Great. Well, thank you. Okay. For our last speaker today, we have Mark Francis for a legal presentation on, basically assessing the legal and contractual risk and uncertainty with bug bounty programs, vulnerability disclosures, and information sharing. Mark.
Thanks, John. I hope everyone can hear me okay, and the slides are now on the screen. I am a partner at the law firm of Holland & Knight in New York with a focus on tech and data matters, especially in regards to cybersecurity and data privacy. I'm also a board member of the New York Metro InfraGard Association, and it is a pleasure to be presenting a webinar here for the New York Metro Joint Cybersecurity Conference. I know the title here is a bit of a mouthful, and we will certainly break it down. I will also try to not get into the weeds on the legal side of things and really talk about some of the kind of forefront issues that many companies are trying to deal with when it comes to vulnerabilities, but not just in the classic defensive ways, but what do you do? What new strategies for detecting issues? New strategies for responding to issues? Do you share data? Do you not share data? Who do you share it with, and why? And thinking through those issues, not really from a legal perspective, but more from a strategic, thoughtful process, and what are the business, operational, reputational, and to some degree legal implications of these activities. Many businesses are being forced to make a judgment call, and sometimes in the heat of the moment, and are looking for people within and outside the organization to help them understand what are the issues, brief management, help senior management make very important decisions around these issues. And so we're going to jump right into it. I'm going to break it down into three buckets, so to speak. One is talking a little bit about bug bounty programs and what are the pros and cons and how they work and what are the pitfalls. Another topic that's somewhat related is around vulnerability disclosures and information sharing, and how that is done. And finally, talk a little bit about dealing with stolen data or disclosing stolen data. Many of us know that there's a lot of data floating around on the internet, either on the clear web, on the dark web, in various, underground, criminal markets. And so thinking about that and what you could or can't do and what are the risks in dealing with that data, given that many companies have legitimate, reasons to be dealing with it. So to get started off, I've tried to create, we can call this a simple example, but this is really a bit of an ecosystem around disclosures. And so, I didn't want to put actual company names on the slide, but you can think about, a classic social media or online tech company that we can call InstaFriends here. Many of you, right away will come to mind some other companies in similar scenarios in real life. And they deal with, a lot of technical risks and security risks to their platform in many different ways. And so just to start out and talk about who the different players are here, right? They may hire their own penetration testers, either, inside the company. They may have a team that does that. They may have an outside consultant who provides penetration testing services, and they use them to test their app, to test their website, to test their network, periodically, maybe every quarter, maybe once a year, maybe more often, hopefully, for a big platform. They may also engage with a a bug bounty organization that kind of helps them interact with, freelance hackers. And so, there are a number of them. The popular programs are Bug Crowd and HackerOne, but for purposes of our scenario, we'll call this organization HackerFriend. And they're the ones who interact with, the good hackers, the white hats as they're known, who operate, legitimately and above board. On the other side of the screen, we see at the bottom the black hats, which are typically the folks, the hackers around the world who engaged in criminal activity, unlawful hacking activity. And of course, as many know, there are many individuals who operate somewhat in a spectrum between the white hats and the black hats. They're often known as the gray hats. So there are people that sometimes are engaging in legitimate activity or in unlawful activity, and sometimes they're engaging in activity that is questionable under the law. And I'll talk a little bit about that without getting too much into the weeds. But some of the other players here are obviously the FBI, Department of Justice, in terms of enforcing the law and prosecuting criminals. The DHS and the U.S. CERT might operate as a warehouse, a clearinghouse of vulnerability information and disclosures. And there may be information sharing organizations. So, for example, the quote IT ISAC in this scenario would be a industry consortium that operates to share information. And we're going to talk about different examples in reference back to this idea. So let's talk a little bit about the bug bounty ecosystem on the left side of the screen between InstaFriends and HackerFriend and the white hats and what that entails. So a bug bounty program, it encourages security researchers, in other words, white hat hackers, to report security issues to the sponsoring organization in a responsible way. And so even the government has operated a number of different bug bounty programs. They had one called Hack the Pentagon, and they try to provide certain incentives for responsible behavior. And so those incentives might be, they don't want the disclosure made public immediately, because if there are vulnerabilities and issues, the sponsoring organization wants an opportunity to fix it before the issue is made public. They also will reward the researchers who find issues with money or recognition or swag, T-shirts and coffee mugs and other things, maybe an invitation to their company's conference, sometimes even expenses paid, let them give a presentation on their findings. And so, different incentives can be created under these bug bounty programs to encourage this responsible behavior. And what's really phenomenal for a bug bounty program and what distinguishes it from the classic, penetration testing scenario is that penetration testers can find something or they cannot find something. You can spend a lot of money and they don't find things. Really, with the bug bounty program, you're only paying for results. So the people who find things and they report them, they can get, some kind of payday or reward. People might spend 6 weeks, looking into your website or investigating your platform. They find nothing and they don't get paid. So from the organization's perspective, you're paying for results, and that's very cost effective. So let's talk a little bit about some of the pros and cons here. The pros are, even with penetration testers or internal information security teams, it's really very hard for them to catch everything. And I think about this as being, if you think about a house, how can you guarantee that an ant or a bug will never get into the house, right? I mean, things change every day. People open and close windows and doors, and the foundation, which may have been perfect when the house was built, over time deteriorates. New conditions change, pipes crack, things leak. And so this is such an evolving system that, the internal or the pen testers will virtually never catch everything. And so the bug bounties provide you with another means to find things. You get access to hundreds or thousands of researchers, and you give them a profitable outlet. There are many researchers overseas that have supported themselves by legitimate lawful hacking, and they may be based in India or elsewhere in Asia or other countries, and they make a good living legitimately finding security issues and responsibly reporting it and getting paid. And perhaps they would be doing this illegitimately if they didn't have an avenue for this. And you think about it almost like the Napster days with people downloading media, music and videos illegally. There wasn't really a lawful digital way of getting that kind of content. Now, that we do have those legal means, the amount of unlawful activity has gone, not that it's gone to zero, but certainly many people who wanted to act lawfully have an opportunity and a means to do that. And again, you're paying for results, and you have some control over the disclosure, when it happens, who it happens to, what information gets shared. Obviously, there are some cons to a bug bounty program. They're not your employees. They don't work for you. You have limited control over them. Certainly, people who start out operating in a bug bounty environment can ultimately attempt to, commit extortion or exploit the company and use their findings in a way that is not appreciated. Disenchanted researchers can go public if they feel the company is not giving them enough attention or enough money or otherwise keeping them happy. And so, bug bounty programs are not, the perfect solution, but they are one of the solutions, that many companies have found increasingly is necessary to help shore up their security posture. And bug bounty programs, there's no bug bounty law. So really, there's this contractual ecosystem that companies open their bug bounty programs into, and there are many different documents, and this is where the legalese can become really a pain in the neck for everyone involved. Because, for example, you have the InstaFriends company, and they have their online terms of service on their website that says, you're never, ever allowed to hack us or commit any kind of activity on our website or on our platform, that would in any way, harm it or steal data or, do anything of that nature. In the meantime, they've contracted with HackerFriend, the bug bounty organization, which has a disclosure policy. They may have a code of conduct. They may have their own terms for the white hat hackers operating within their network. And then, when InstaFriends opens up a bug bounty program with them, they will create a set of, program terms, which basically say some hacking is permitted. You're allowed to attack this website or this IP address. You can't commit a denial of service attack, but you could, try to, maybe engage in other forms of hacking, cross-site scripting, and other activities. And so what happens here for the security researchers is you're subject to multiple sets of terms and conditions, 3 or 4 different contracts, and it's very hard for a non-lawyer to parse through what those conditions are. They can be conflicting at times. Even for lawyers, it's really a challenge to figure out what the controlling provisions and terms are. So that creates a lot of uncertainty. But at the end of the day, what the goal of having this program is to try to clarify that. And so explain what the commitment to security is and what the goal of the program is, what the scope is, what products or domains or websites are what kind of vulnerability exposures are subject to the program, offer some form of safe harbor to researchers that says, hey, if you're operating within the scope, the defined scope of this program, we're not going to sue you. We're not going to ask the FBI to bring a criminal prosecution. We're not going to come after you because you technically violated our website terms of service. And so give researchers the comfort to operate within the scope of the program, and give them a very clear process for reporting. How do they report to the company? What kind of information should they provide? Is there is there an online form? Make it easy and simple for them to follow that process, so they can do it in a way that makes it easy for the organization to respond to findings. And sometimes even offer preferences. What are the priorities that you're looking for researchers to look for? Maybe you'll pay more for certain kind of vulnerability findings than others, based on what the risks are, or the priorities to the organization are, and even get insight into how the program works and what works and doesn't work for researchers. And all of this helps form a program that's appealing to researchers and gives them the comfort that this is going to be worth their time. There are different components to a program. Some programs are ongoing. Some programs are only for a 6-week or 8-week time frame. Sometimes only certain researchers with a good reputation or with a pre-existing relationship will be invited into a program. Other times it's open to anyone. One of the very important parts about the program that sometimes companies will forget is they launch the program, and then findings and reports start coming in, and there's no internal process in the organization to actually respond. And so researchers start sending you, hundreds of findings, but there's no one in the company, or there's one poor guy whose job is to somehow try to field all those requests and all those findings. And researchers will get very frustrated. They think they found some solid gold here, and they're waiting for the company to say, hey, we're paying you $50,000 because you found something really important. And 8 weeks later, they haven't heard anything, and they say, screw it, we're going to post this on my blog so I can get a lot of attention and go speak about it at DEF CON. So, having the internal process to intake those reports, to vet them, to give prompt responses to submitters, and in a very timely way get the findings addressed within the company on a good time scale is really important, and the internal part of having a successful program. And then there should be a communication plan. How are you going to respond to researchers? What are the company's policies? How are you going to interact with them and avoid issues? And there's a lot of guidance out there on the internet. I've put down some links here. Different organizations have put out guidance on how effective disclosure programs could work. Now, the bottom line for many organizations, and this is when it hits the news, is when there is a PR mess. And for examples of this, you can go to krebsonsecurity.com, and he loves writing up all sorts of examples where companies, either as part of a bug bounty program or sometimes even just ad hoc, a legitimate researcher will find an issue, report it to a company, and the company just ignores it, or threatens them about going public with it. And so this is kind of the unfortunate chain of events on this slide, where researcher reports an issue, they may demand payment, but they will also very often demand that the company be responsible and fix the issue. And the company just fails to respond, or it has some boilerplate, we dispute your findings kind of response. Researcher threatens to go public. The company gets very nervous. Their lawyer sends out a 3-page cease and desist letter. Researcher posts the cease and desist letter online, along with all the vulnerability details and his proof of concept script that he wrote to exploit the issue. It goes viral on social media. Now the company has a full-fledged media circus on their hands. Their investors are calling them to inquire about it. Maybe the regulators are starting to look into it. Customers, especially commercial customers, get very nervous and want to know what's going on. And so, the bug bounty program, and this is not limited to the bug bounty program scenario, but, these kind of scenarios where companies are getting in disclosures about vulnerabilities and issues require companies to have an internal process to responsibly deal with these things and but A, fix the issues, but B, maintain a solid reputation and make sure that things don't get out of control. And so in order to do that, there's different things that organizations should be thinking about. One is there should be a clear contractual relationship. There should be rules of engagement about what's permitted and what's not permitted by outside researchers. There should be some expectations, some very clear payment terms, because if a bug bounty researcher thinks that he's entitled to a $100,000 payday and he gets a $50 check, right? There's going to be some clear stress in that relationship, and so being upfront about what the payment terms are, how an organization will value different kinds of disclosures. An organization may only allow hacking activities within test environments, not environments that actually have their customer data that might be exploitable or discoverable there. And so, it's important for organizations to think through upfront the clear contract terms and having conflicting language between their terms of service and their bug bounty conditions and the hacker friends conditions. That confusion is not only problematic for researchers, but ultimately it's problematic for organizations as well. Companies also need to think about the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty around their ability to come after researchers in an enforcement way. So a researcher threatens to go public and the company, threatens to sue them or report them to the FBI. It's important to think about how likely the company is to be successful in those activities. Whether the researcher breached some contract terms, whether there are federal hacking laws that could be applicable. What are the PR and reputational considerations of going after a hacker that's going to attract a lot of media attention and reflect poorly on the organization? Sometimes the company has an ability to bring it into a confidential arbitration as opposed to a public court setting. And very quickly, I'm just going to touch on some of the legal options that are potentially available for organizations to think about. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is probably the most predominant federal law around computer hacking. And a lot of it is actually intent-driven, and it's up to the discretion of the DOJ in terms of when they want to enforce it. And so the law is so broad that it's been criticized by security researchers and others, but the law is usually enforced when somebody is viewed by the DOJ as operating in bad faith. They're intentionally hacking into a computer because they want to do harm to the computer, because they want to steal data, because they want to knock the computer out of service. And so, having the bug bounty relationship or having, other kind of approved forms of activity gives researchers more comfort that they are not going to be subject, to hacking violations. Under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, there are also some protections around circumventing technological measures like encryption. And these laws were originally passed for things like DVD protection, the ability to prevent individuals from just getting a movie on a DVD and then printing 300 copies and then sharing it with all their friends. But the DMCA has been used in a broader way when people put out software that might be used for hacking purposes to undermine encryption and other protections. And so under the DMCA, there are some security research exemptions, contingent on person operating in good faith. They did in a controlled environment, not in a way that would cause harm. It's not used to facilitate any kind of copyright infringement and things of that nature. And so, what we end up here with is a little bit of a catch-22 with bug bounty programs, and this is what the organizations are really struggling with. One is that on the white hat side, they're investing a lot of time and energy in vulnerability findings. They may not be able to find anything that they get paid for, and even if they do, the company can say, we're not paying you, and if you go public, we're going to sue you. And so for an individual, a freelancer working out of their house or working part-time doing this kind of work, that's very dangerous. They don't want, they don't have the luxury of being, covered by their company's lawyers and things of that nature. And so they're taking on a risk engaging in these activities. There are going to be, a lot of legal terms that they may not be comfortable navigating in the different contractual obligations that the program is governed by. Their ability to hire lawyers to defend them against claims, even if claims don't have merit, is something that's just a concern to, those individuals. At the same time, companies are also have concerns. And so, they don't have a lot of control over these researchers, whereas if they have their own in-house employees or they have, a hired company that's under very strict controls, very strict contractual terms, they will be able to keep things in line, whereas, the bug bounty researchers are kind of going off and doing whatever it is they want. Sometimes they go off the rails and they cause all sorts of reputational issues for the company. It also, sometimes the bug bounty programs are an excuse that the researchers give to circumvent the terms of service and anti-hacking laws. And so they'll say, look, I was doing this legitimately, whereas in truth, the bug bounty program researcher may have caused harm to the company. And there was a story in the news not too long ago, and without mentioning any names, the company paid off certain hackers who actually managed to steal customer data, I believe, from the company, and they paid them off under the kind of, they considered the check to be a bug bounty check, and they did not notify affected customers. And there were a lot of questions that got raised around whether that was legitimate and whether there were legal notification requirements to affected customers when the data got stolen. And so, it's one thing for a bug bounty researchers to say, hey, I found, a vulnerability with some of your code. But what happens if a bug bounty researcher says, hey, I was able to get into your system and download your entire database of personal information of your customers or of your employees, pay up, and, you may be paying them, but you're also, by virtue of that information, now in a world of legal exposure, and now you need to notify a lot of people. And so understanding what it is your researchers are allowed to do and not allowed to do is just critically important. And so here's some just quick operational takeaways. And again, I'm trying, we'll break this up on the operational and the legal side, but from an operational perspective, the bug bounty programs are really about relationships. A company is going to have relationships with these freelance researchers, and you want to maintain good relationships with them if you're going to have a program. There needs to be a level of trust that they feel that their activities are going to be properly rewarded. They're not going to get messed over by the company, and the company wants to work with researchers that it feels are being straight with them. And so trust and relationships are really very important. There needs to be an understanding that you won't have complete control over these researchers. There will be challenges, but that doesn't mean that not having a bug bounty program is the better approach, because it does provide an outlet. It does provide another way for companies to get warnings about vulnerabilities that they wouldn't otherwise have. And so, it does serve a really valuable purpose. But as we talked about before, it's very important to have a robust internal process for fielding the issues that may come up with difficult researchers, making sure that the PR, the media folks can be involved if there are reputational issues that come up. There needs to be an internal process for, taking these reports in, responding to researchers, and keeping them happy in a way. And owning up to it. If you say you're going to reward them monetarily, recognition, other things, there needs to be resources allocated to do just that and not cheap out in the end. But there are also some legal takeaways here. So legal threats can work at times, but they can also backfire. So companies really need to proceed with caution when they're going to kind of take that approach. So cease and desist letters nowadays, every time you send a letter, you should expect that it's going to be posted on a website and go viral, right? And as a general rule, I've always told clients, never send an email if you would be uncomfortable with that email showing up on the cover of the New York Times or in front of a judge and a jury. If you would be embarrassed in front of a judge, if you would be embarrassed if it's in the New York Times, you probably shouldn't send that email. Certainly in a corporate setting, so setting aside your personal email, certainly using a company email account where you don't own that email. That email belongs to the company. That company may be sued. There's going to be a lawsuit. They're going to have to turn over emails. I've seen it many times. And so, whenever you send a letter, whenever you send an email to a researcher, you got to think about, how is this going to look if it goes public? How is the rest of the industry going to react? And this has happened with a number of companies that have sent these threatening emails to a researcher. Researcher went public. Nobody else will want to do any work with that company because they know they're going to find something really valuable, and instead of getting paid, the company's going to threaten them, and they're just going to end up with potential legal exposure. And so, think about that. Really think about, what are the contract terms if we're starting up a program? How can we be really clear and set up the ground rules in a way that are they make sense, they're easy for our white hat participants to work with. There's means for them to engage with us if they have questions or concerns. Keep in mind that asserting the federal hacking laws can be challenging at times. And you definitely need to have some clear evidence of violations. And so if they're arguably operating within a bug bounty program, it may be hard to say this guy is a, cold stone hacker, bad guy, and he's going to have a whole sob story about how he was just trying to do the right thing, and this nasty company is burying him in legal fees. So I think we've kind of really covered the full spectrum of the bug bounty ecosystem and kind of the different thoughts and takeaways around that. Let's talk a little more broadly around vulnerability disclosures and information sharing. And so vulnerability disclosures are more around exploits, right? And so somebody finds an issue, an exploitable, bug or issue within a software platform or online service, and now they want to report it. And so, who do they report it to? Why would they report it? Why would they not report it? All of those are issues that, organizations need to think about. Kind of somewhat different than that is the concept of information sharing. We're not really talking about exploits at that point, but we're talking about maybe stolen data that's been obtained from bad actors, maybe working with law enforcement and you need to share some of your company's internal data or some of your customers' data with them. So for example, there's been some hacking attempts and you want to share a list of IP addresses and user account information with the FBI so they can help you figure out who the bad guys are and maybe trace them back to where, either in the States or overseas, based on IP address and other information, timestamps, other information. But as part of that, you may be turning over information about your users, about their IP addresses and their online activities and their account information. And so, you need to think about, well, can we do that? Do we have privacy commitments to our users that we don't share that information? And then finally, really kind of the threat intelligence variety of bad actor tactics, what kind of identifiers you have around bad actors, what kind of techniques they've been using, social engineering, different information that the organization has collected. Again, who do you share that with? Why would you share it or why would you not share it? And so I want to jump into that kind of side of the house a little bit. And so here's a slightly different scenario here where InstaFriends, they have a competing company and we'll call them frenemies, right? And so you'll have different, and it could be different banks, different healthcare institutions, different tech companies, You can have your Uber and your Lyft, right? And so on one hand, these are different legitimate businesses operating in the marketplace, and there is an incentive for them to cooperate with each other because they're all under attack from bad actors, from cyber attackers all over the world. And so there is some incentive for them to cooperate with each other. On the other hand, they are still competitors. So, for example, let's say InstaFriends discovers that the new mobile app that was released by their competitor frenemies has a glaring vulnerability, and someone can exploit it to steal other users' data, other users' GPS location information, their dating profile, all sorts of sensitive information. And this does happen. We have worked with clients who have been in very similar scenarios to this. And so what do you do? Who do you tell? If you're InstaFriends, on the left-hand side, maybe you give a big press conference about how you discovered your major competitor has major glaring security issues. Maybe you sell their stock short, and then you go public with it. Or maybe you try to play nice, and you tell them, by the way, we were poking around in your system and we found a vulnerability. Are they going to appreciate that, or are they going to ask you why you were poking around in their system? Do you disclose it to the DOJ, to a DHS, U.S. CERT, or one of the government organization that collects this kind of information? Do you share it through the industry consortium that shares, threat intel? And maybe that's a way to anonymously put the word out in a semi-public, semi-private fashion, where they don't know it came from you, but you want to get the word out so they can fix the problem. And so if you think about it, there are so many different disclosure scenarios, and I've just put some of them up here on the slides, and it breaks down roughly into the two buckets of you can do a confidential disclosure either to the government or independently to the affected organization. You may have confidential disclosures to security companies like the antivirus companies, so they can update their software to pick up on certain kinds of attacks, or maybe use industry organizations, ISACs, or others to share that kind of information. And then there are the public disclosures. You post it to the government in a way that it's going to be made public, or you report on it on your own company security blog, or you go to the media and you give it to reporters, or you get up at a security conference and you attract a lot of attention explaining how you were able to exploit a vulnerability, and now the other company is really in the hot seat trying to respond to that once the information is out. And so there are so many different scenarios, and organizations need to think about different considerations for when you're going to go the confidential route, when you're going to go to the public route. And frankly, there are times you're not going to tell anyone, and you say, look, we found something, but there's all sorts of risks around it. It's not our problem. We're not going to tell anyone. There has been an increasing recognition in the public and private sector that we're all in this together, and there is a need for organizations to share with each other, and everyone's under attack, and the ability to share with each other improves everyone's collective ability to defend against attacks. And so, whereas we're coming from a model where nobody shared with anyone, we're increasingly going to a model where people do share with each other through different mechanisms depending on the circumstances. And so, going the confidential route, you could prevent exploitation of the vulnerability because you're giving an organization time to fix it. But there are many companies now that have policies like, we will give you 30 days or 90 days notice, and then we go public. And the reason for that is because you're going to force the organization to fix the problem. Because if they think you're never going to go public, they may be too lazy or too resource constrained to actually fix the problem. And so there's a dual, we're confidential for 30 to 90 days, and then we go public. You may, and very often we work with companies that will have confidential disclosures to law enforcement in non-public investigations to go after criminals. and really, protect the industry at a whole. But going public is frequently the approach that people take for a variety of reasons. First of all, definitely gets the most immediate impact. As I said before, it can force changes. A lot of people want the reputation. They want the street cred. Security researchers will very often go public with things to get that attention, and that is their way they operate. Some organizations want the competitive advantage. Maybe they'll go public as evidence in a legal dispute, right? They whip it out as an exhibit at trial. Nobody's seen it before. It has a real dramatic impact. And some organizations will even do it to make money off of it. As I'm going to show in the next slide, this has actually happened already, and there's a lot of uncertainty to what the ramifications of doing something like that would be. So there have been some lawsuits around disclosure disputes, and again, this is another kind of area where organizations need to take a little bit of care before they go public or they make certain disclosures. And what's unfortunate for me, I guess, as a lawyer following these issues, is that most of the time these kind of cases settle out and there's some kind of backroom deal. Maybe one side pays the other side some money and they agree to walk away from the case. And what that means is we haven't had a thought out substantive decision from a court saying, here's what you could do and here's what you can't do. It is okay to go public. It is not okay to go public if you're trying to influence the stock market. There may be different activities that could or cannot be acceptable, and there has not been a lot of law developed in this area, and that creates some uncertainty for individuals or for organizations that want to make certain kinds of disclosures. And so one I would mention, to me, was the most interesting one was the St. Jude medical case, where a hedge fund had gotten a security team to discover vulnerabilities in pacemakers, and then they sold short on the St. Jude stock, and then they went public with a huge report detailing all these vulnerabilities before actually telling St. Jude about it. And so, in theory, I would imagine they made a good amount of money in the immediate aftermath of that going public. St. Jude sued them for defamation, deception. They claimed that the disclosures weren't completely truthful or factually accurate in some ways, and did harm to the company and to its stock price. And so that settled out of court. But that's a very kind of extreme scenario where companies are trying to monetize security issues. Obviously there are we've dealt many times with security researchers that will contact an organization and say, hey, I found a vulnerability with your system. I'm going to go public with it unless you pay me a $200,000 consulting fee, in which case I'm happy to work with you on solving and I won't go public with it. And if the company does not, pay out, then they go public. And so whether or not that constitutes some form of, illegal blackmail, and whether even if it does, constitute some illegal activity, really, what does that help the company, right? So if they go public with it, yeah, you can go after this individual in court, but the damage has been done, right? The reputation of the company has been harmed. Your customers are all wondering what's going on, and so thinking about those issues is really challenging. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about kind of the stolen data variety. And again, we're seeing a lot of very innovative uses of stolen data, and there's a lot of uncertainty around it. And so, I want to talk about that a little bit. And, one interesting example that I saw was that Facebook goes onto the dark web and buys stolen usernames and passwords so they can compare it against their list of user accounts and see if, so let's say a different company has had, 1 million usernames and passwords stolen. Facebook wants to know if the bad guys will use that information to hack into or get, unauthorized access into Facebook accounts. And so Facebook goes online and buys stolen data so they can protect their users. And the question is, is that legitimate? Is that lawful? If it is unlawful, would anyone actually criticize them or come after them for that? And really, there's a lot of discretion here in terms of, what is lawful and what isn't lawful. There's a lot of undeveloped law around data and who owns data and who has rights to data, and are you allowed to buy stolen data? What are you allowed to do with it? So, for example, the first example of dangerous data, companies may seek data regarding account compromise. Many of the credit card companies will routinely go through the dark web to find stolen credit card numbers so they can flag them and make sure that they're not getting subject to fraud. And that's a common practice now. But what happens if you want to search for your competitors' data and see if their data's been stolen and it's for sale? If you can buy your competitors' secret data online and use it to your advantage, is there anything wrong with that? Maybe yes, maybe no, depending on the context. What about M&A due diligence? And so you're interested, your business is interested in buying another company, maybe a peer company, maybe a competitor. You want to buy them, you want to merge into them, and you want to understand. They're telling you that they have a lot of valuable intellectual property, a lot of valuable technology. You may want to go onto the dark web or onto the internet and see if that information has been stolen and if it's on sale elsewhere, and what the risks are. Or maybe their customer database has been stolen online and you're going to buy this company, and 3 weeks later you're going to be sued because they had a massive data breach 6 months ago. So, can we go online to look for clues around that company and whether the data has been compromised? Or maybe you want to find data that you can use in some form of legal action, lawsuit as evidence. And what about, companies, hedge funds that go out and buy stolen data and then trade based on that data? Maybe they'll find that some pharmaceutical company is in the middle of discovering some phenomenal, high profit, drug, and they're about to go public about that, and they want to trade on that information. Can you do that? And so, rather than tell you yes or no on the phone and invite a whole lot of risk here, what I would say is that these issues have all come up, and we have worked with companies to try to navigate what the risks are. And usually, it's not going to be a yes or no answer, but here are the risks. You're unlikely in this case to have a problem, or you may have a problem, or you may want to talk to the FBI before you do something with the data. And then on the other side of things are what happens when the government comes to you. So the government makes demands. You're a cloud service company. The FBI, the DOJ approaches you. They have a warrant. They want you to disclose their customer data. Can you disclose the content? Can you disclose the metadata? Some of those requests, certainly when it come in the form of a FISA order or national security letters, are completely confidential. You don't necessarily even have the ability to go to court to fight it in some scenarios. And so companies need to think about, what are their risks here? What is their process and a plan for dealing with those kind of demands? Even more challenging at times is what happens when the government doesn't demand it. They just ask for it nicely. Do you cooperate with them? Do you not cooperate with them? They may ask you, you've been under the cyber attack. We want to work with you, help you figure out who did it and why. Can you turn over your hard drives to us so we can look for clues? Do you cooperate with the government or not? If you do, to what extent can you share data with them? You may be under contractual obligations to your customers on your website privacy policy. You may have, contracts with commercial customers where you promise to keep their data confidential. Are you going to be in breach of contract if you turn that stuff over to the FBI? And then there are, proactive notification means. So there's the iGuardian platform used by the FBI for threat tracking. The AIS is a DHS portal for threat indicators. The US CERT system used for vulnerability tracking. And many organizations use these things and want to proactively share intelligence and information with them to make sure that they're valuable to the industry. And so organizations need to have a policy and a procedure for what kind of information they're going to share. And so this kind of brings us to the later trends and the encouragement of the government to share. Every time you speak with the FBI or others, they are really asking you nicely to work with them so they can help organizations. But there is some distrust always between the private and public sectors, and no company wants to turn over evidence that could be used against them in a court of law. And so, companies tend to shy, away from sharing, although it's becoming more and more of a critical need. And so government a few years back passed the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act to help promote this, provide some safe harbors around, sharing so companies aren't punished for it. And that information that gets shared with companies won't be subject to FOIA requests and other risks. And so, where does this leave us, right? When it comes to information sharing, in my mind, everyone wants everyone else to share, right? Everyone wants to get the benefits of the sharing, whereas nobody is overly inclined to share their own stuff, and there are always concerns around that. And so, it's very important at organizations to work with management to help them understand what the risks and rewards are of information sharing and disclosures, what you have to do, what's optional, what the considerations are. And I've tried to kind of capture that, today, with this presentation. But, to think about some of the risks are, companies are very concerned about attribution back to them when they share information. Even the bad actors may get access to the information that gets shared, especially if it's in a public forum, and that can give bad actors insight into the capabilities of the company that shared it. It can trigger regulatory inquiries. You shared that you were subject to an attack. Now the regulators come knocking. They want to know all about it. You may lose competitive advantage if your company is set up to protect against these threats and your competitors are not. Some organizations are really concerned about raising the expectations for cyber practices where, if they're sharing information voluntarily and that becomes the norm, does that mean that in a year the government won't pass a law that says now it's mandatory and now you don't have a choice? And so organizations are always nervous about doing things voluntarily that might then make it a mandatory obligation in the future. And there are some antitrust concerns about, all the organizations in the financial sector or the tech sector sharing information with each other in a manner that could present, some kind of antitrust claims or inquiries. But there are rewards to this too. The open exchange helps combat the bad actors, and everyone does have that need. At the same time, it compels responsible companies to protect their products and services. It creates more knowledge and awareness out there. And at the end of the day, security events can have repercussions for a whole industry. So you think about, the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica incident, right? And so, what that did was bring to light a glaring issue that is now creating a setting where the Congress is contemplating a federal privacy protection law for consumers. And so because one organization had a major public incident, and other organizations have had significant, maybe not as significant, but other kinds of incidents, those events collectively have repercussions for everyone. And everyone starts getting sued more, or the courts become more liberal in the law, in customer protection rights, new laws and regulations that everyone will now be subject to. And so, sometimes it's better for everyone to voluntarily cooperate with each other and prevent these things from happening at the get-go than to it's everyone for themselves. But at the end of the day, everyone is going to be caught up in the legal battles or the investor is being nervous about security issues and risks, and other kind of, issues. And so, with that, all of these issues are challenging for organizations: bug bounties, vulnerability disclosures, dealing with data and stolen data and not, non-public, data of other parties. And while they are, they're important to gain the attention of senior management at companies and gain media and public and government attention, a lot of times, the management and others in the organization really need help and insight into the various implications of these activities and how you safely operationalize and engage in these activities to help the organization while protected at the same time. So hopefully, I've been able to offer some ideas here that everyone on the line will find helpful. Certainly, you're welcome to reach out to me with any questions or follow up. We may have a couple minutes here to address a couple things, but either way, feel free to reach out to me. One thing I noticeably did not include on my scenario slides is the big building of a prominent law firm that people should call to deal with all of these issues. But I kept our firm logo in the footer. So basically, the lawyers are always somewhere involved trying to get a piece of the action, and help organizations navigate through these issues. And that's what we do, fighting the good fight every day. So thank you.
Hey, Mark, thank you very much. I just want to ask you a single question. I know, you talked about the bug bounty program, and one of the things I've come across myself, and I don't know if you talk about, there's a nuance, what constitutes a bug and what's the, a bug bounty researcher may find the severity of a bug or rate it differently than the company. And that's also come back to bite some companies.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a learning process, really. We're in the infancy of bug bounty type programs. And so, while there's been a lot of advancement in how to organize these programs and how do you work out the reward system and the rewards program, and how do you classify different kind of vulnerabilities and different kind of, high risk, medium risk, low risk, and then price them, that is always a very sensitive subject. Naturally, companies, tend to say it's worth less than the researchers tend to think they're worth. And there's been some bad, fallout when they can't come to terms. But I think, the industry collectively has come up with different classification schemas, and following those schemas and coming up with some clear guidelines will help in the long term resolve that.
Great. I do see a question on the chat. There's a few questions. I'll just combine them. Has your firm ever represented the good fairy hacker type?
So we've represented both organizations that, and when I say my firm, I would, I've been to a couple of firms in recent years, but we've worked to represent organizations that are having these kind of programs and want to understand and deal with, issues that come up. We've also worked with organizations that have found problems and had issues with their disclosures. I don't recall a time where we worked with an individual researcher. They tend to not, hire the big firms. But we have worked with organizations that have found problems in very uncomfortable scenarios. So, for example, it's a problem with a competitor, or a problem where they don't want to be associated with the finding, but they want to get it out. And who do you get it out to? Or maybe it's a problem and the company that has the problem is not dealing with it responsibly. What do? How do you put pressure on them while not getting yourself into trouble? And so, we've helped researchers or, really organizations that have found vulnerabilities figure out what's the best approach in their circumstance.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'd like to thank everyone. I just have one question for each of the speakers, and it's real simple. If you had to say one statement or one takeaway that the crowd could go back to their desks and basically improve the security of the corporation, what would it be? And I'll just go backwards on the list. Mark.
I think organizations should be a little bit proactive about having a process for dealing with cybersecurity issues, sort of like an incident response process, but you may have the data breach scenario, but also think about incident response and what happens when you find an issue, you have an issue. How do you have an established procedure to deal with it? Maybe the pre-clearance from the company to act appropriately.
All right, thanks. John McClurg.
Embrace the new, cut through the cloud and the fog of battle and test for yourself. There's a lot of new opportunity out there in the strength of what the new paradigms offer.
Great, thank you. Matthew.
The only thing that I would contribute is that we really need to start thinking like the hackers. If we're not thinking like the hackers, we're lost.
Thanks. Alan. See if I can take Alan off mute.
So we don't have to worry about it so much. You are the other guy to almost everybody else in the world other than you, and you are vulnerable.
Great. And finally, Jeff.
The software developers have heard your cries, and they've developed good internal controls that you can configure. So educate yourself and help defend yourself.
Well, thank you, everyone. Feel free to ping me with questions. You all have my email from the Eventbrite registration. And if you have any questions about the speakers, or I'll be posting their presentations by tomorrow, as well as sending out a survey. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.